Good morning, guys, and welcome out to Revolution. We're going to continue looking at the Textual Confidence Collective. And so they've just released a couple of videos in the last few days. And so one of them is entitled, Is it Just to Slander Westcott and Hort? And when I first listened through this, I listened through it. I didn't really watch it, the visual. It just seemed like a basic sort of Bible study on slander. And I was almost tempted to sort of skip it in a sense where it's like, well, you know, we want to deal with the main things that these guys are saying. But then this morning, as I started it up and I went back through the vast majority of this, I think it was about 28 minutes of it, I thought there was enough said in the comments in between to warrant some discussion. And so I'm going to just play the whole thing through. And when Peter Montoro is just talking and saying scriptures, most of the time I'm just going to be watching and just listening. But he does take some things out of context. He does say things that are just factually wrong. It's no big deal. You would see, you know, if I went to a Bible study or listened to a sermon, I could probably point out a few things that are wrong here and there, but I get the gist of what he's saying. Now, if anyone wants to join and chat about this, down the bottom of the screen is a StreamYard link. If you just type that into your URL and you've got a webcam, you should be able to just jump straight in. And so there is the invitation to do that. So Docky Bible Club is in the house. Let's just get straight into this.
A fascinating discussion that Tim.
Whoops, I'm on 1.75.
Welcome to another episode of the Textual Confidence Collective. We're coming to you not live from San Antonio, Texas. We've just got done finishing a fascinating discussion that Tim led with Peter Gurry, Abinand Shah, and Maurice Robinson about Westcott and Hort and the prominence and use of their theories today in New Testament textual criticism. And the original Textual Confidence Collective, the four of us, Peter Montoro, Mark Ward, yours truly, Tim Berg, and Elijah Hixson, have finally gotten back together.
Yes.
After, boy, has it been a year and a half?
Been a year and a half. We're almost two.
Oh, my goodness. And we want to take up something that I've seen a need for, and Tim especially also has seen a need for: constant slanders of Westcott and Hort, of their character, of their beliefs. And I think it's been especially on Tim's heart to point out how slander is a sin.
Yeah.
So we want to establish some truths here for ongoing debate. After kind of dealing with some of the more academic elements of the use of their theories, we want to talk about the men, Westcott and Hort. You might know the Textual Confidence Collective from our earlier videos. We push for confidence in the text of Scripture rather than textual absolutism on the one hand or textual skepticism on the other. And Maurice and Abinand, who were in the previous session, they do not quite hold the same view of New Testament textual criticism that the four of us hold. But we had a fascinating and collegial discussion because we stand with them for textual confidence against textual absolutism. And of course, we stand with Westcott and Hort on those matters as well. We want to open in prayer, actually. And since we're going to examine the lives and work of several Anglican scholars, none of us are Anglican. We're all low church boys. But we want to pull out a collect. We confirmed the pronunciation of this word just before the session, just in case, that Westcott, B.F. Westcott, Brooke Foss Westcott, wrote for his own family devotions. And I wonder if, Tim, you could.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will just pray. I'm happy and fine to pray in written prayer. So as we go before the Lord, that can be helpful and has been done for many, many, many centuries in the Christian church. Blessed Lord, by whose providence all holy scriptures were written and preserved for our instruction, give us grace to study them each day with patience and love. Strengthen our souls with the fullness of their divine teaching. Keep from us all pride and irreverence. Guide us in the deep things of thy heavenly wisdom and of thy great mercy. Lead us by thy word into everlasting life, through Jesus Christ our Savior. Amen.
So let me introduce the topic this way. We've done some prep here, and we've got a plan we want to talk through. Everyone's going to get a chance to talk. But actually, my introduction to King James onlyism, my most formal introduction, taught by my otherwise excellent pastor, for whom I'm grateful back in my high school years, there was really one thing that stuck out to me that I remembered over the years, and that was that Westcott and Hort were very bad dudes, and anything that they touched was bad.
Okay, so if you watched the last video, or the last two videos that I did, what I pointed out was that these guys, what they usually do is they look at things that are probably misconceptions about Westcott and Hort. They looked at some assaulted quotes and people saying that they're in the occult and all this sort of stuff. Because in this arena of textual criticism advocates versus King James onlyists, as they label us, you have people like Peter Ruckman, you have people like Sam Gipp, you have people like Stephen Anderson, and even if you just look at Stephen Anderson and Sam Gipp, talking about certain things, they've been at war with each other, and they'll say all sorts of things about each other and to each other, and so there is quite a lot of heat generated in this discussion. But like any discussion that is about ultimate truth, you'll have people on both sides who say things that are stupid and that are kooky, that are dumb. They'll put that in print. They'll make a book about it. I've had people contact me and say, hey, can I use the material on your Textus Receptus website? And I said, well, it's all in public domain. Use whatever you want. And they've actually printed a book. And if you go through the book, it says, click here for more information. They've actually just copied and pasted pages into this book. Like, how can you click on a book? And some of it wasn't. Some of it was accurate, and some of it was sort of like just bits and pieces where I'm talking about, sort of like a general understanding of things, but I haven't really made it into like a Textus Receptus defense article. It's just like a general sort of thing that you would find on Wikipedia or whatever. And they've just sort of copied and pasted that and put it in there. And I'm thinking, this guy's just not really thinking about things. He just wants to make a book. He wants to make money. And so, unfortunately, that's what happened. And what I'm finding with these guys is they look at the comments that are really low hanging. And I sort of made the example of like, say, when we look at what happened with George Bush and the weapons of mass destruction fiasco that happened in Iraq, they went into Iraq, claiming that they had weapons of mass destruction. Now, they thought they would have them because the Americans had the receipts from the Iran-Iraq war when the Iran-Contra affair happened, and they were sponsoring, funding Iran as well, at the same time as Iraq, and a million people died in that war. But George Bush went in there on that premise that there were weapons of mass destruction. So they went in there, they're looking everywhere. Oh, we can't find them. But while we're here, let's turn the thing into a car park. Let's, spend a whole bunch of money through Halliburton, through Boeing, through GE, through, and if you know the story about the military-industrial complex, that's what basically that war was about. There was really no other reason. Like, they were trying at first, like 9/11, and everyone's like, actually, there were no Iraqis involved. And there was a whole bunch of reasons. So who do you blame? Well, you sort of go, okay, well, it's intelligence officers. Well, it's the military. Well, people are sort of blaming, but it's actually an intentional thing. They intentionally went in somewhere, anywhere, to get the military industrial complex gears moving. They needed a war. They needed to make profits go to Halliburton, to Dick Cheney, to the Bush family, to whoever. And so this is just part of what they've been doing for the last, 40, 50 years. And so, but I'm sure that there were things said about George Bush that were untrue. Now, usually when I'm trying to say something that's politically controversial, or it's pointing out a fact about something, I usually try and make sure that I only say what is verifiable. because I've been in that horrible situation where you say something and someone knows more than you in the room, and they're like, "Hey, where'd you get that from?" And they point out that what you're saying is hearsay, and you're like, "Oh, actually, that was a really silly thing to say." And so I actually feel embarrassed when that happens to me. And so, unlike some of these text critic guys who constantly just repeat the same easily discredited arguments, like sometimes I'm online, I'm like, do you realize that other people are watching what you're saying? Are you embarrassed? Did you ever feel embarrassed by saying wrong things? I do. I actually sort of pride myself that I try as hard as I can to have the truth. And so that it's so much easier to live that way. It's stress-free. If you've been lying all the way through, you have to remember dates and stats, and it's like, oh yeah, I said there was this happened then and it didn't happen, and you just free yourself, just stop lying, So obviously things can be said about George Bush that are untrue. Like, people, if you wanted to go into the kooky land, now this could be absolutely verifiable and true, okay? But I'm just using this as a bit of an example. If I was to talk about, oil interests and the Bush family, Prescott Bush, and go into the history of the family, where they've made their money, etc., you could make a very good case that George Bush was involved with all that. He was complicit in that. He became president basically to help his buddies, to help the military-industrial complex, or basically you could turn around and flip it all over and say the military basically put him in power, which I think is, to me, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I could make a case for that, but if I turned around and said, hey, George Bush murders babies at Bohemian Grove, okay, like this is a sort of Alex Jonesy, Texe Marrs type of kooky land. I don't know that. I don't know that he's, doing homosexual rituals down in Florida with his Skull and Bones friends. I don't know that. You know what I mean? And I'm sure that there's been articles and things printed about that. And people have spread stuff about George Bush, the George Bush family. I'm sure that even the disgruntled Muslims, 1.5 million Muslims died because of, that war in Iraq. Basically the Christian community was just completely decimated in that area as well. And so you got a lot of disgruntled people who would probably say things about George Bush. I'm sure they're saying, he's a, part of the Illuminati or whatever. I don't know, though. It could be, could not be, but it would be slanderous for me to say that he is if I'm not sure. Or it'd be slanderous for me to say that he's involved with, sexual immorality. They've got a picture of him on, Epstein Island, with the towers fallen and all this sort of stuff. And if I'm not 100% sure, I can't just make things up. And so this is the whole thing with the 9/11 stuff. It's okay to say, hey, look, I'm a bit sus on what's happened there. But when it's like, look, I know exactly who did it. It was this guy. Just because you feel like it was a certain person, you've got to actually have facts backing up what you're saying. You can go as far as saying, I think someone else did it, but you still got to have the facts. You know what I mean? And so people get involved with this hearsay. It's rife in this generation where people, they have facts for a certain point, but then they make their own conclusion, and they don't understand that making their own conclusion, unless it is factual, can be slanderous. And so if I could say, look, George Bush is a war criminal. I could say what he did was basically just for profit, just for, the military-industrial complex, for Boeing, GE, Halliburton, Dick Cheney, or Condoleezza Rice, all these other people involved with that. And I can prove all that, okay? And I can go through and make a very strong case for that, and I believe I would be able to prove that. But I couldn't prove that he's a sex deviant. You know what I mean? I could. Some people will just come out and say that as if, oh, well, George Bush, of course he's. I'm only using George Bush for an example. I know some people really love him and think he was a great Christian, the bulwark of Christianity in America and all the rest of it. But I'm not American, so unfortunately, we're from Australia. Oftentimes we're bucking at the system and we're pointing out, we've never been that royal friendly or anything like that, and so I'm just using that as an example. But at the end of the day, it's like the Epstein thing. Yes, there's issues with the whole Epstein thing, but you've got to stick with the facts. It's okay to speculate as well. That's fine. But you've got to say, this is my speculation. And this is what I think happened. But at the end of the day, I can't prove that. And you got to have that caveat. So what happens in King James only land? People go, this is, Westcott and Hort, they are like this and like that. And it's easy to prove that these guys were absolutely off the wall. Okay. It's very easy to prove. But can I prove that they were Satanists? I don't think I can prove that. And I don't think anyone's been able to prove that. And so I think that's just not worth saying. Now, did they attend seances? Yes, they did. Okay, but not everyone who attends a seance is a Satanist, but they're definitely hugely compromised. And you'd have to have a strange concept, a strange eschatology of the afterlife to believe that there are ghosts that you can contact. You'd have to have a strange understanding of the Bible to mix the Old and New Testament, to think that you could practice what Saul did in contacting, spirits, contacting Samuel or whatever he did. It's forbidden in Scripture. And so, but I can say, so this is why sometimes in my videos, what I do is I avoid the kooky stuff. And I see plenty of kooky stuff come on the Textus Receptus Academy. People put up a meme and it's like, it's like arguments for creationism. There's really strong arguments for creationism that we need to talk about and we need to share with atheists. Now, there are some really dumb arguments for creationism. Now, Answers in Genesis brought out 15 arguments that you should not use for defending creationism. One of them was like the moon landing footprint. There was only, half an inch of dust, or I can't remember what the details were, but they were saying, don't use that type of argument. It's silly. It doesn't help our case. And so at the end of the day, there's a whole bunch of arguments that Gal Ripplinger, Sam Gipp, Ruckman, that these guys bring up that I constantly see sort of like repeated, because some people have discovered this position, this bibliology, through those people, that they've come in the gate of knowledge through reading Ruckman or through being part of a IFB church, which was an Andersonite church or a Gippite church or a Ruckmanite church or whatever, and so they have a little bit of baggage from that. And so, but usually, say with the Textus Receptus Academy, people will say things, and some people in the comments and chat will say, well, actually, it's better to say this, and that's why it's good to have iron sharpening iron. We correct falsehoods. And I guess the thing is, I haven't come from the IFB or the new IFB or anything like that. So half the time I'm hearing an argument and I'm like, it takes me a while to even understand why they don't want to quote from Hebrews, because that's only for the Jews, and all James is only for the Jews and all this. I'm like, that's like the sort of Ruckmanite old IFB sort of stuff. And so for me, I read through Hebrews and think that it applies completely to me. And so as well as the Hebrews, but it was written to the Hebrews, but the application, just like Galatians is for me as well, and 1 Corinthians is for me as well. And so anyway, these guys, what they're usually doing is looking at those kooky arguments, the arguments that we usually are trying to get away from. And so oftentimes they have a broad circle. King James onlyists, Textus Receptus onlyists, they'll mention people like Jeff Riddle, myself, D.A. Waite, Ruckman, Ripplinger. They mention all of us in the same context, in the same sentence, sort of like, we're all basically the same. Tim Berg sort of prides himself that he hasn't really engaged in, slandering people and calling them, King James onlyists and all this sort of stuff. Because one of the things is there is a dirty type of tag that comes along with King James only labels. And even back when I used to listen to a bit of D.A. Waite, so D.A. Waite would say, look, the King James only tag, that seems to be applied to Ruckman, but not to us. We're mostly Textus Receptus people. So he would say, we follow the underlying Greek of the Textus Receptus. So this is an interesting issue within the what would be labeled Textus Receptus King James camps. There are people who just go, oh, it's King James, and they don't even bother with Greek or Hebrew. They don't bother with those things. They're just like, well, I've got the English, that's it. Where other people are like, no, it's the underlying Greek text that is, and you might have a confessional bibliology position where people are like, well, we follow the text of Scrivener, we follow the Masoretic text, etc. And the King James is just a very good and accurate rendition of that. And so you've got quite a lot of different positions and different ways of getting there. You have some people who follow the Westminster Confession of Faith. You have others who follow the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, and they're sort of very similar with the words being kept pure in all ages and this type of thing. But at the end of the day, most of us are very different. There are some people within this grouping that I don't like. There's some people who don't like me at all. They hate me, and they'll sort of quote a lot of other people and they'll just leave me out, like I'm just not in existence. And it's like, okay, that's fine. But it's like being involved with, I might be a pre-trib guy or something like that, or a post-wrath guy, whatever eschatological camp you're in. You don't necessarily have to agree with everyone in that group, do you? You're a Trinitarian, and so you don't have to agree with a Catholic who just comes along and goes, I'm a Trinitarian too. If these guys were to say that you're part of that group and it included the Catholics, and then they started blaming you for what's happening in the Catholic Church, you're like, hang on, that's slander. But this is exactly what Mark Ward does. He basically labels anyone who believes that we have all the words of God today. He says that we're Ruckmanites. And it's the most slanderous thing. And so when I'm going through this study here, I'm looking at the face of Mark Ward and just going, what aren't you getting, dude? You are engaging in slander. And recently, Mark Ward and Timothy Berg, they were sort of stretching out their hand to people. What they often do, or what Mark Ward often does in his videos, is he'll describe one certain person. Oh, there's one guy in the chat who seems to be able to think and able to grasp what I'm saying, and he seems to have an honest heart. It's so rare among King James onlyism and Textus Receptus advocates that you find someone who's actually open to discussion. So in other words, it's passive aggressive. Everyone else is closed to discussion, doesn't want to talk about these things. I'll invite Mark Ward can come on this show anytime. He is welcome to come. Tim Berg can come on anytime. I've challenged Tim Berg to a debate in the Book of Acts a couple of years ago, and he didn't want to, and that's fine. You don't have to accept every debate challenge, but I invite him onto the show to discuss anything that I've said. But apparently there are, these, he'll probably just say I'm uncharitable, that's their way out. Because you have to be like, hello, you Mr. Ward, and be all grovelly. Where in most other doctrines, we're not like that. It's like, oh, you believe, pre-trib, post-wrath, and people are like, well, you're an idiot. I think you're an idiot too. And that's just the way debate goes. But apparently in this, the textual issue, we all have to be treading on eggshells, and we all have to be, charitable to our brothers and all this. And so their definition of charitable is basically they do exactly the same thing as the people that they're, shocked at, but they do it in a passive aggressive manner. So they were reaching out to Bryan Ross. Okay, so Bryan Ross became one of these guys who's, it's like, wow, there's a guy on the internet who's actually listening to us, who's actually conversing with us and saying, yes, there's a false friend here. He recognized there was a false friend and all this sort of stuff. And so they befriended him. They were chatting with him, but then they realized after a while, Bryan Ross did a series against the Textual Confidence Collective, the last set of videos they did. And he's got a really good position. Now, I don't agree with his verbatim identicality statements. I do agree with to a certain extent, but there are some things I'm like, no, I don't agree with that particular thing that you've said. And so, and that's fine. I disagree with Jeff Riddle on some stuff. We're all from different backgrounds. We're all going to have our own opinions on things. But as a whole, we are basically from the same position in our bibliology. Everything else might be different, but we have similar bibliology. But what these guys did, Timothy Berg and Mark Ward did they did a video on Bryan Ross, basically throwing him under the bus, calling him a coward and saying that he was lying. Now, it was quite amazing because Bryan Ross did a series of videos, and he's very meticulous in his research, and so he's written a lot about King James Bible. He's written a lot about he does a series usually every Sunday. He's talking about things like the marginal notes in the King James or the preface of the King James and all the stuff that these guys say, oh, King James only people never know about, And so it's interesting to listen to, and Bryan, we would disagree on certain things, but when it comes to this, we're in agreement. So they befriended him, then they threw him under the bus and slandered him, and it was evident to everyone who was on our side, the TR King James side, looked at this and went, "Why are they slandering Bryan Ross?" They basically just got rid of him. And that like that meme where you got this car driving down the road and someone's getting thrown out of the car, and it's just like people used to put, like Bernie Sanders there, he's getting thrown out of the car, and it was the car's Hillary Clinton. It was like that. These guys just wanted to have someone at the time who could be a King James guy who they could be friendly with, but then they realized actually people are going to his channel, they're getting convinced with his argumentation, and they're turning away from the critical text. I don't know what their motives were to slander Bryan Ross, but to me, it's amazing that these guys are now saying, us King James guys are slandering Westcott and Hort. Now, it's for this exact reason why sometimes I just stick with one fact or two facts. There might be 50 facts, but there's usually one or two that are just absolutely concrete. Okay. So, when I'm talking about George Bush, I'm only talking about a few little facts here and there. I'm not going off into Bohemian Grove land and, Skull and Bones and, Epstein Island. And I'm not going into all that as provable as they might be in some people's eyes. It's like, no, I'm just going to stick with the facts. Okay. And so that's why I bring up George Vance Smith. So those three words, that name must just haunt these guys. They haven't brought him up yet, but I guess they're going to probably bring him up in the last episode. But George Vance Smith, he was a Unitarian. So Unitarians are sort of like Jehovah's Witnesses. They don't believe that Jesus is God. They usually believe he's a created being. And many times they'll have an issue with eternal hell as well. They'll try to come against that. So I'm not sure what George Vance Smith believed on that. But I do remember when I read through his book, George Vance Smith's book, he was talking about forever and ever. I think it was in Jude or something like that. It might have been in Romans. But he was sort of saying that it needed to be saying something else. But George Vance Smith, Unitarian, doesn't believe in the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, in the unity of the Godhead. He believes that the Father is God, Jesus is like a created being, and I guess sort of like Jehovah's Witnesses. Maybe the Holy Spirit's the Spirit of God, or it's electricity, or whatever, So, but it's not the Orthodox view, and so this guy would be considered a heretic if he went to your church. and started talking, you would walk out, you would leave. If the pastor invited this guy to preach next week, you would probably leave that church for good. That's how bad this guy is. You wouldn't allow me to have a Jehovah's Witness even come on this show. Now, hey, we've got Bob here and he's going to talk. You would say, oh, Nick's having Jehovah's Witnesses on. Why is he doing that? And so, so what you see is these guys are not really acknowledging the main elephants in the room. What they're doing is they're going around this periphery of, sort of like statements that get spattered here and there. And of course, I'm sure that if I read through all the material written about, George Bush, even from reputable sources, I would find one quote in there that's like, well, actually, that's not really provable. That's not really, we can't really say that about him. No, I'm sure that we would find those type of things. So it seems like that's what these guys have done. They've just gone through and they're finding, just the quotation here and there about Westcott and Hort, but they're not dealing with the main issues. These guys had Unitarians they were working with Unitarians, and they had Unitarians do communion with them in the Church of England. That caused a massive uproar. Their committee was going to be stopped. Basically, that George Van Smith was going to get kicked off the committee, and they said, we will all leave if you don't allow this guy to be on the committee. Now, that's sort of summarizing it, as far as I know, from David Cloud, reading David Cloud's material. He seems to be one of the more studious, Baptists out there who's written a lot about this issue. And so, and I've listened to a lot of D.A. Waite's material. Now, the reason I'm saying that is it's not going to appear in this video, but in the third video, they talk about things that have been said about Westcott and Hort. And it was Floyd Nolan Jones. Now, the first time I ever read his stuff, I think it was back in 2005 or something. He had something about the Septuagint. So I read through that. And he was mentioning Ruckman, which at the time, Ruckmanism, it was just like, if you even gravitated towards like, oh, the King James is the word of God, it was like Ruckman. And so you were just like, oh, well, I better not be a Ruckmanite. It was like this scarecrow that the critical text guys had set up, where if you walked towards that truth, you had to basically wear the Ruckman t-shirt to get there. So it was like, no, I'm not a Ruckmanite. So all the time, no, I'm not a Ruckmanite. I'm not a Ruckmanite. And people, they were sort of trained like that. So you'd say, oh, I think the King James is accurate. Oh, you're a Ruckmanite. Straight away, it's the first thing James White said to me in 2007? It might have been around 2005, actually, when I wrote my first Easter article. I chatted with him in a group, and he just said, you're a Ruckmanite. And I was like, and at the time, I read the New King James. And so it was so strange to be labeled like that as a Ruckman. I didn't even know who Peter Ruckman was. I just knew that you couldn't be like him. And if you went King James, you got the Ruckman t-shirt as like the carryover little package that the little show bag that you get with that. It's like, oh, do I have to wear this t-shirt? Everyone's like, well, whether you want to wear it or not, we're going to call you that. And so this is the thing. They slanderously call me that, Ruckmanite. Mark Ward still does this. He's slandering Bryan Ross. He's slandering me and thousands of other people as Ruckmanites when they're not. They're not following Peter Ruckman. There are many people throughout the ages. I mean, John Bunyan, he was saying that the English Bible is akin to the originals and things like that. He would be considered an absolutist and a Ruckmanite by these guys, which it's just slander. So these guys, in their attempt to, talk about slandering Westcott and Hort and all the rest of it, they're throwing a lot of us under the bus, and they're slandering us. So they're actually projecting, because they are practicing slander, but what they want to do is make out that we're the ones practicing slander. Now, I've listened to D.A. Waite's material. I don't agree with him with everything. There are some things, like when sometimes he would say, well, there's only, 423 or 470 word changes in the King James. And he'd say, out of, I think it was like 700,000 words or whatever. I can't remember the details. He would say out of that many words, 421 or whatever is not a huge number. And I would think, no, that's wrong, because you're making it 421 actual words when it's actually 421 words that could appear 500 times or 20 times, or and so that he was sort of making these type of jumps with numbers, and I didn't agree with that. When I was listening to him, I was just like, I don't agree with the way that you're bringing that forward, but that's him, and so he would talk about the Aleph and B, the B-A-L, the Baal manuscripts. So he would call them the Baal manuscripts almost in every time he talked about B and Aleph. And to me, it's just sort of unnecessary. Sometimes he'd go through a whole bunch of D words: deception, deceit, devil, and a whole bunch of D words. And I'm like, what are you doing? Yeah. So when I listen to D.O. Wade, it's like, okay, I'll take what I believe you've said is true, and what you've said is that I don't agree with, I'm just going to not use. So if he quoted things that weren't correct about Westcott and Hort, it's just like, all right, that's just something I won't listen to. And so if you go to the Westcott and Hort Resource Center, so I'll just put this up here, they have like frequently assaulted quotes. Okay, so I'm not sure who runs this. I haven't really gone through it, but they have Gail Replinger, Waite, Gipp, Fuller, and Holland. That's sort of the guys who are saying things that are not correct about Westcott and Hort. But the thing is, where's the page on George Van Smith? You know what I mean? It's just like these guys. Do we have to consider them as like saints or something? These guys are absolutely heretical. That they have, they're defending non-Trinitarians, people who don't believe in the deity of Christ, and they're defending these guys, and they're allowing these guys to work on the text. They're inviting these guys to work on the text. So to me, that's problematic. That's a huge issue. And so anyway, we'll go back to I just sort of bring that up because some people, they watch one of these videos, they haven't watched the first and second one, and so I just sort of thought I had to bring up a bit of a caveat of why I'm doing this video and how to watch this video, because some people will just watch through this and go, yeah, they've got a point. It's like, no, they're dealing with periphery issues. Westcott and Hort have a really bad reputation, and we are calling them out, and rightfully so, because they were wrong in many areas. Now these guys are saying, oh, this quotation's wrong here, this quotation's wrong there. It's like, okay, so some people got it wrong over the years. Why not just deal with the things that are true and deal with that? But apparently they're going to do that in their last video. So it's sort of like, maybe they're saving their last video. They'll go through some of these ones that I've done, or maybe they'll look through the comments and say, oh, they're all talking about George Van Smith, or they're all talking about this, and maybe they'll do a last video of that, or maybe they've already recorded the video. I don't know. But let's just go through this and listen to Peter. So A. Hannah says he's just living the dream in the chat. Mark Ward specializes in low-hanging fruit of King James only. Exactly. The thing is, like, say, with the study that I did on Revelation 16:5, I looked at everything. I looked at Ruckman. I looked at Ripplinger, people who I wouldn't usually go to, but I'm looking at everything. I looked at Waite. I looked at Holland. I looked at White. I looked at Metzger. I looked at Westcott and Hort. And I'm still going through everything. Anything written about it, I'm going through. And so, but you can't say that I've just adopted D.A. Waite's conclusion or, someone else's conclusion. I've thought for myself. And most Textus Receptus people who are like doing what I'm doing, like Jeff Riddle, there's a bunch of guys writing blogs and things, like other guys making videos like Van Cleek's, very good videos, very interesting videos, fascinating. DeSoto, some guys have sort of, they're stopping and starting. But people who are actively, chatting and doing blogs and videos and stuff like that, they're usually free thinkers. And there's a bunch of stuff that we could fight about and disagree about on all sorts of things. But when it comes to this issue and when it comes to looking at what Mark Ward's saying, usually we're on the same page because it's glaringly obvious. All you have to do is use a bit of logic. And you're like, no, Mark, that's wrong. No, that's incorrect. No. And so we're on the same page because of that, because we have a common enemy. And what you find is these people, Taylor DeSoto said it so brilliantly, like we're a cult without a cult leader. Like all the aspects that if you look up, what is a cult, and there's 15 points of a cult, like we don't fit any of them. We don't have a leader. We're all learning off each other, and it's not an echo chamber because we all have, many of us, vastly different eschatological timelines to do with the Book of Revelation. Many of us have even different soteriologies. There's once saved, always saved. There's people who aren't, and there are people who are differing levels of once saved, always saved. Because I'm running into lots of people now explaining what they have with eternal security and things like that. There are people who have, who are cessationists and people who are not. There are people, and so you can't just say it's an echo chamber, and we're just all stuck in. I understand there are groups like the IFB perhaps, or the new IFB, who are sort of okay that they might be in an echo chamber. I don't really know that much about the old IFB. Apparently, it's huge, but we're not in an echo chamber. We're listening to other voices. And the thing is, too, we're going through these guys' material word for word, commenting. And I'm not like just being selective with the videos I do about Mark Ward. Most of the time, anything that he's saying that's on this level of, King James only, TR people are wrong, I'm doing a video on it. Now, if he's just doing this word's wrong, and it's like a 40-minute video about it, it's like, okay, well, whatever. But when it comes down to these issues, we're going through, and sometimes I'm making, I think I made 20 videos on the Textual Confidence Collective, and many people commenting on it. Bryan Ross did a bunch of videos on it. So it's not like we're all just not focused on this and listening. We're all listening. But he wants to make out that none of us are listening. And we're all crass, and we're all just lying about him, and we're all calling him effeminate, and we're all saying he's a homosexual or whatever, playing the victim card. It's like, anyway, so I think we can all see that he is just looking at the low-hanging fruit of King James onlyism. He's not really dealing with truth. So A. Hannah says, the things you're saying, Nick, is creating cognitive dissonance. Mark Ward can't slander while he is calling out other people. He doesn't align with, or vice versa, for slander. That's a really interesting point, because if you're committing a sin, it's a bit like you get really paranoid of your partner going out and hanging out with friends on a Friday night. Is she committing adultery on me? Usually, if you're perverted, if you're committing adultery or doing whatever, you have a certain tendency to project onto the other person that they're doing that as well. So we see this all the time. You see a couple, the girl or the guy will be completely faithful and just like going out to get milk, and they're like, oh, who are you seeing, and who are you talking, who are you texting, and all this sort of stuff. And it's because the other person, they think just because they commit that sin, they think everyone else is capable of doing that. They think everyone else is like that. It's like I remember being accused of stealing. It was like, oh, you're stealing. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was like I got accused of stealing a bunch of stuff. And I was like, why would I do that? It was, and it was only like $200 worth of stuff, like as if I was at a job and I was probably making, that and more a day, as if I'm going to risk my job for something so little and so petty. And I'm a Christian. I've got just no reason to do that. And if I did do it, I wouldn't get caught, But yeah, apparently I was accused. But then it got found out that the guy accusing me was doing that. And so that's what I'm talking about. Here, Mark Ward, he's engaging in slandering us as all Ruckmanites. He's engaged with, you look at the way that, I don't know how Bryan Ross could have done it better. Maybe if he had a Mark Ward t-shirt on, Mark Ward is the best or something like that, maybe Mark Ward would have gone, okay, I won't slap you. Because they befriended him, they shook his hand, and then they slapped him. And they threw him under the bus. And there was a comment. So just bear with me. I'm going to try and get this comment. It was on Facebook. Textus Receptus Academy. Okay, so I'm in the wrong account here. I run 50 YouTube pages, not YouTube pages, Facebook pages. And yeah, so let's go to the TR Academy, which I know a lot of you guys frequent. Okay, so here it is. I'm going to show my page, which might not be the best thing to do, but so yes, someone wrote, I have to wonder whether or not your representation of Bryan Ross's video series on Exact and Perfect in the preface meets your own standard of slander. And then apparently, I'll just jump down here. Actually, I'm glad I opened that because that's the DA weight one, but that'll come in handy the next video. Yep, I actually said, I can't wait for them to do a show defending King James from the false accusations of pedophilia and homosexuality. Can you imagine that? They're going to have to go through all of their ranks and go, well, Metzger said this and this guy said that. And, everyone's saying he's homosexual. It's like, have you got any proof of that? And so a lot of us have looked into it and found no proof at all. So there was, yeah, here it is. So that was, I have to wonder about Bryan Ross. And Mark Ward responds, listen to this. I believe so. I love Bryan as a brother in Christ and still correspond with him. Tim does too. I wish to say nothing further. But Bryan Ross has done like a heap of videos explaining how these guys are slandering him. Like they're not answering that. Like, wouldn't you think they would go, okay, let's get together and just do a quick video on, hey, Bryan, look, we didn't mean this. Maybe we said something wrong. No, he's not even doing that. He's just like, no, we're still friends. Case closed. It's like, okay. So in that light, let's go through the slander video. It's just, is this comic relief for us who believe in a certain bibliology that God sent us in some clowns that we can laugh at?
That message came through to me as a 14 or 15-year-old. I can't remember how old I was when this sermon series on why we use the King James was preached at my church. My church did not harp on the King James all the time, but I definitely got a strong dose of Westcott and Hort are bad. And it seems, and I'm really basing this on what you've written, Tim, but it seems that the argument for King James onlyism when it comes to Westcott and Hort often starts with an unstated premise that any heretical hands that have touched a biblical text taint it beyond redemption. It's like sticking, I've heard this analogy 1,000 times, you have too, 1,000,000 times. I'd rather have pure water than, water with a bunch of dirt in it or water with even a tiny little drop of poison in it.
It's not the fact that they just touch the text or use the text. Mormons use the King James. There are people who I disagree with and think are heretical who are TR guys. You know what I mean? They wouldn't fellowship with me. I wouldn't fellowship with them. The Christadelphians, they don't believe in the Trinity or the deity of Christ. They use the King James. It's actually refreshing when I go and talk with those guys downtown because they use the King James. At least they're quoting the same scriptures. Well, when it's with the Jehovah's Witnesses, it's like, what's going to come out of their mouth? Some weird, strange. It's like they're using an NIV or something. But it doesn't. Just because someone touched a text doesn't mean that it's tainted forever. That's just oversimplification. what they've done with the text is they've distorted it. They've redefined a bunch of words. The committee they were with, the English committee, have redefined a bunch of words. But Westcott and Hort have omitted approximately 3,000 Greek words and changed about 8,000 Greek words as well. So that's what they've done. We wouldn't care if the guys who did that were, shining stars of Christianity. If they do that, it's wrong. But it just so happens that these guys have all this other dirt on them as well. So we're just pointing out, hang on, these guys have done the wrong thing. They've not only distorted the Bible, but they have Unitarians working with them to distort the Bible. So the whole thing about Unitarianism and that era, as I explained, I think it was in the first video, the Trinitarian Bible Society had to be formed in 1831 because so many Unitarians had overtaken the Bible Society. So you're looking at 50 years before Westcott and Hort, the Bible Society, basically a lot of Trinitarians left and formed the Trinitarian Bible Society because so many Unitarians were in it. So that was the atmosphere in England at the time. Unitarianism was rife, and that's the era that the Jehovah's Witnesses came out of. A lot of Unitarian cults that are still with us today, the Christadelphians. Even the Seventh-day Adventists were involved in Unitarian doctrines, denying the deity of Christ. If you meet hardcore SDAs, usually they can have that whole, we're vegans, and we are also, we doubt the deity of Christ. Sometimes you run into those guys who they're actually reading the documents from, going back to the prophecies at 1844, the Millerites, and going through Ellen G. White's material. But, so let's just continue with this.
And the reasoning continues, with another premise that actually you were undermining in the previous session, Tim, that all modern translations are basically based on the Westcott Hort text, and that modern New Testament textual criticism has really not moved on beyond.
So they're trying to make out in their previous video that the Westcott and Hort, people are saying, the Westcott and Hort text dominates the text field. Basically, it's the same text as Westcott and Hort, so people haven't moved on from Westcott and Hort. Now, if you just watch those two videos, we showed lots and lots of quotations, basically saying Metzger was saying that. So many people were saying we haven't really moved on from Westcott and Hort. And even I myself, I haven't really even, Westcott and Hort they don't fascinate me at all. For these guys, they're fascinated with Westcott and Hort. They want to defend Westcott and Hort. For me, it's sort of like Westcott and Hort are sort of like the 12 prophets in New York with the Jehovah's Witness Society. It's like they bring out the Watchtower and the Awake magazines. I've got really no interest in those guys. It's like, I hope that they repent. But at the end of the day, when I look at Westcott and Hort, I don't have much interest in them. So it's not like I'm going and digging information about Westcott and Hort. But even I know, I've got no fascination with them, but even I know Metzger, he said when they created the United Bible Society text, they got the text of Westcott and Hort and used it as a draft. That was their main text. So just as much as Tim Berg and many others will say, the Bishop's Bible, they created 40 copies of the Bishop's Bible, and that was their main draft. And sometimes what they try to do is say, see, it's just a revision of the Bishop's Bible. And even some people will falsely say, see, they didn't really even go to the Greek and Hebrew. And it's like, no, they did. And one of the rules was to override the Bishop's Bible with the Greek and Hebrew. So basically, it's just a draft, okay? But regardless, in a similar fashion, Metzger said we got Westcott and Hort's text and we used that as a draft. So what I did in my last video, I went through how the Nestle text was formulated, but by the time they got to Metzger, Black, Carlo Martini, who happens to be a Jesuit, and Kurt Aland and other guys, the text was, they basically just got rid of everything else and put Westcott and Hort there and added and subtracted according to their scholarship. So they went right back to the Westcott and Hort text. And many scholars are saying, like, if you just read through, I did have a stack of books here that were dealing with the topic, and I was bringing them up each time. But if you go through Pickering's book, he has quite a few chapters on Westcott and Hort, on how scholars are basically saying we haven't moved on from Westcott and Hort, or how basically we were sort of trapped with the TR position. Now we're just trapped with the Westcott and Hort position. We're not really building on that with new information or anything like that. So many scholars are saying that the Westcott and Hort text is dominant. Many scholars are saying that it's not just like a TR thing. It's not a slanderous thing to say. It's, if you're actually informed in these positions, that's the conclusion that you would have to come to. And so anyway, so everyone's sort of talking about that recently, and I don't think anyone's really gone, yeah, that was a really good point. We've moved on from Westcott and Hort. Most people, like actually Metzger said it. Most of the leaders in critical text circles are saying it. So this is one of the things I can't understand why Mark Ward lets Tim Berg have free course here. It's because I'm pretty sure that Mark Ward, he really doesn't understand these issues that well. And I just know, because I'm sort of in the field myself and listening to his stuff all the time, as I do with Bryan Ross, as I do with many other people who are involved with text criticism. I'm listening to Bart Ehrman, listening to all, and you listen to Mark Ward, and it just drops down like 3 levels. He doesn't really know what he's talking about. He just makes statements, and you're like, yeah, that's wrong. Oh yeah, I used to think that like 20 years ago, or yeah. Or you hope the young fellow will get better, sort of thing. And but Tim Berg's sort of gone off on this other tangent, but he's got some extreme views. He's got some really strange views, and he's the one making up these, the Textual Confidence Collective, naming it. He's the one sort of going, oh, we're textual absolutists, or we have textual confidence and all this sort of stuff, where textual skeptics, these type of labels, they don't fit. And so anyway, I'm starting to preach. A. Hannah says, why would you want to accept unholy hands touching your text? Yeah, they're trying to defend this. Now, I'm sure there were plenty of people in the era around Westcott and Hort, people who were using the King James, quoting the King James, who were just off the wall. Okay. But they weren't changing the Bible. That's the difference. If you've altered the Bible, it's like, well, who did this? And then we're looking into it going, oh, Friends of Unitarians, they're attending a seance. So what are these guys do? Who are these guys? Even with Herman Hoskier, as much as I appreciate the work that he did on the Book of Revelation and a few other things, and defense of the Textus Receptus, he actually contacted a clairvoyant to try and find the provenance of a manuscript. So I'm not into that. I'm like, that's off the wall, dude. The Bible forbids this type of thing. So that it just shows you that these people, they're willing to alter the text of the Bible, which the Bible is very clear in Revelation chapter 22, verses 18 and 19. Don't do this. They're like, well, challenge accepted. I'm going to try. That's their first sin. But then they turn around and they do all this other stuff. And Unholy Hands on God's Holy Book, that was written by David Cloud. I recommend everyone read that. It opens your eyes. He's sort of like 90% of people involved in the textual field are off the wall and heretical. And they're like Bart Ehrman's, but just they're still in a church somewhere. And he's just pointing out those facts and stats and figures that people over the years have been absolutely heretical, and they've been allowed to alter the text. Why should we put up with that? I mean, and one of the things I've pointed out too is, as harsh as I am on Peter Ruckman and Replinger, who would you rather preach at your church? If I said, hey, your mum and dad are going to come to a service in this particular church, but you can only invite these preachers. Either you get Gail Ripplinger in to preach the gospel, Peter Ruckman, or Bruce Metzger, or I'm going to say Carlo Martini, but I want to be fair, or Kurt Aland. Who would you prefer? I'd probably go, maybe Peter Ruckman, because if you want your parents to hear the actual gospel, you would be like, well, they're probably going to faithfully preach that. So the thing is, the worst of our, that we're all collectively put into this group, the worst of our heretics are way better than the best of theirs. The Bruce Metzgers and the ones at the top of the pile. Our heretics are actually more orthodox than the best of theirs. It's so bizarre. It's so strange.
Their viewpoint. Then I've heard this many, many times. Westcott and Hort were occultic apostates who denied the deity and resurrection of Jesus, the inspiration and infallibility of Scripture.
And so what I'm finding as we go through this is, yes, some people have said this about them. It can be hard to actually, prove this stuff without sort of getting into all the weeds and everything. It's not like the George Van Smith thing where you go, who's this guy in the room with you? Oh, he's a Unitarian. That's the easiest thing to do. Okay. And that's what I do. I try and stick with just that until I've got a whole, there are other things that I can show, but it takes longer. It's more complex, and you have to go through their writings. And you have to go through other people's writings, see who's saying what. And even Mark Ward, when we're going through this, he's like, oh, I think that's a false friend. And, so he's getting into all those sort of weeds where I'm just like, Unitarians involved with the text. Why? Would you trust anyone getting Unitarians involved? No, you wouldn't. I wouldn't trust someone. If someone was a Sunday school, not looking after the Sunday school, if they didn't believe just basically in the Trinity and the deity of Christ, I wouldn't have them come into a church and run that. You know what I mean? You wouldn't have them involved in any ministry in your church. The Unitarians, the heretics. The Bible is clear. Those who teach things contrary to what you've learned, avoid them. Have nothing to do with them. History document says Adam Green from Bibliotheca also has this strange admiration for Westcott and Hort. The heresies of Westcott and Hort are well documented. Yeah, it would be good to actually sort of create a bit of a Facebook thread where we're dealing with Westcott and Hort and what was actually said, because I get the feeling that what's going to happen is these guys are going to say some stuff. And like, this is the book of D.A. Waite that he was talking about, Westcott and Hort. And when you read through it, I know D.A. Waite's material. And as I said before, there's some things I disagree with him. But usually on theology and doctrine, he's pretty sound. He had a PhD in theology, I'm pretty sure. And so he knows his stuff. He's not just, I don't have that. I might know theology. I might have, in some places, very good theology, but D.A. Waite has studied this and he's got a PhD in it. It takes a lot of learning to do that. And then for him to go through his whole life thinking in his mind these type of things, when he sees something that's outside of orthodoxy, he's just like, well, let's point this out. And so all the way through, he's got many, many examples of where Westcott and Hort, let me show you what I'm looking at. He's got, the heresies of Westcott and Hort in bibliology, theology proper, anthropology, hermeteriology, Satanology, ecclesiology, pneumatology, eschatology, soteriology, and Christology. All of those, he's saying that they've got deficiencies or they're heretical in. And so this is the paper that they quote in their next video. Demonology, etc. Anyway, let's continue on. A. Hannah says, I hope we get a good sermon on slander first. Okay, here we go.
And did not vote for your preferred political party, And anything bad you can attach to Westcott and Hort is kind of fair game with these guys. Therefore, all modern translations are to be rejected. And I get this in my comments all of the time on this channel. So I think it's really appropriate to test these premises in this session. And of course, we've already done some of that in the previous session.
Right.
So in this session, we want to ask, what about these various specific accusations against Westcott and work? Are they actually true? Let me just hand it right over to you, Peter. Talk to us about the sin of slander.
Yeah, I think as essential to start, what is actually at stake with this? The Bible has a lot to say about our speech.
Right.
And so, before we start talking about the specifics of Westcott and Hort or textual criticism, we should start with the foundation, and we'll use the King James for this, of what does the King James, what does the Bible, in any translation, what are some of the guidelines it gives us for what forms of speech are appropriate? And of course, we're warned against any form of false speech, so we're not to say that which is not true. So you have Exodus 20:16 and the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And you see, even there in the 10 Commandments, you have a concern, by implication that would address all forms of false speech. But it has a particular concern for speech that causes reputational harm,
Right.
to other humans. So there's a particular concern for that. And that comes out also in Exodus 23:1. Thou shalt not raise, which it's literally lift up a false report. Put out thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. You look at this in its context. In the meaning of raising a false report is of lifting up. It's someone else has put out this false report and you're picking it up and you're carrying it on. So the idea is you're spreading. So that's what's being.
Like King James is a homosexual and a pedophile. I guess, maybe these guys, the Textual Confidence Collective, are going to do a whole series on that.
So that we use the English words a little differently today, but the idea here in both Hebrew and what the King James translators would have intended is that you're spreading a false report. So it's not just that you're not to start one, but if a false report is going around, and you see that in the second half of the verse, you're not to put your hand with those who are spreading a false report. That's not okay. You don't do that. And this is a New Testament principle as well. Ephesians 4:25, wherefore putting away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. And again, there's this idea of a particular concern within a covenant community. Now, it's not like we can just tell lies outside the covenant community. That's not anymore. But there is a concern for our fellow believers, our fellow covenant members, that we are to have a particular extra special burden of guarding their reputations and speaking truth to them. Like again, I want to be clear, we should speak truth to everyone. But there's a particular concern that gets addressed in these and other verses more often than any other form of false speech. And Revelation 21:8 makes it very clear what the stakes are. But the fearful and unbelieving and the abominable and murderers and whoremongers and sorcerers and idolaters, it's a bad list. You don't want to be on that list. And all liars shall have their part in the lake and burned with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. And so, Scripture takes false speech very seriously. And it takes false speech seriously, whether it originated with us or not. So that's the first thing.
And so, if I was Mark Ward and Tim Berg, I would be listening to this and going, well, did we slander Bryan Ross? Or is Bryan Ross lying to everyone and saying he got slandered when it didn't happen? Because that would be, if he's going to have eternal consequences, I'm pretty sure he believes in eternal security. But it's like, if he's committed a huge sin like this, that's a huge lie that he's telling, and I'm telling this lie too, and the whole basically Textus Receptus Academy community is telling a lie. So you guys should really either defend yourself or deal with what's being said in the videos of Bryan Ross. You guys befriended him and you've thrown him under the bus. If that is if we're saying that you guys have accused him falsely, it's a pretty big accusation, because we're talking about slander here. And like we're saying, you Mark Ward is calling us Ruckmanites, slandering us with someone's name like that. And so just like some people don't like that, they say, well, I've got Reformed theology. They don't like being called a Calvinist. I wouldn't go out of my way and call them a Calvinist. You know what I mean? I wouldn't go out of my way and just say you're a ESV onlyist or whatever, or slander you in a way that you saw as derogatory. But it doesn't seem like, well, it's double-tongued. Mark Ward will say, well, we don't really want to say this about this. Like in the last Textual Confidence Collective, they came up with these names, the Textual Absolutist type of name, to get away from the King James onlyist name that a lot of people were bucking against. But then Mark Ward's done videos of like, well, you're a Ruckmanite, which is, so now we've just got all these other names. So you guys aren't actually coming against any names, you're adding to it. You're just redefining it. And so I know Mark Ward makes much ado about people saying that he's effeminate and all this sort of stuff. Oh, okay, well, we won't say you're effeminate. We'll just say you're a sissy. Or you're, it's like, well, it's still, slander, isn't it? I've got really no huge big beef with someone talking like Mark Ward talks. I know people who are very masculine and talk like Mark Ward. Some people have just grown up like that. They grow up in a family where everyone's chatty, talky, and it's like, it's just the way they are. Not everyone grew up with John Wayne as a dad or whatever, but it's like, Mark Ward's like, okay, well, this is slander. They're saying I'm effeminate and all the rest of it. So if we just redefine that, is that okay then? So all Mark Ward's done is, oh, you're a Ruckmanite, or you're a textual absolutist. They're still basically throwing us into the same camp. And they'll use Jeff Riddle in the same context as Peter Ruckman. And they're not making a huge distinction. And so this is a lot of this type of slander comes from James White. Because I've looked at a lot of what James White said over the years, he started getting the Textus Receptus group and the King James group and putting them together. And so he'd show a video of, he'd say, okay, we're going to deal with Robert Truelove today. And then he'd show a picture of Stephen Anderson for like 10 minutes. And then he'd get into Robert Truelove. So what he's trying to do is get into people's minds that they're the same group. And so these people want to remain distinct. They want to remain separate. Even I wouldn't even say that Maurice Robinson is the same as Pickering. Pickering is really hostile. When you read his books, when you read his articles, he's really full on. He's like the Ruckmanite of the majority text group. And that was the thing when Everhard and a whole bunch of these guys were saying, oh, it's really bad that Jeff Riddle and Christian McShaffery were talking about in their book about the received text, that someone mentioned that it's Satan, the works of Satan. But then you read Pickering's article, how he's saying text critics are of Satan. They're following Satan. He mentions it like 10 times. And it's like, why aren't they dealing with him? He's in the majority text camp. And so Everhard sort of came out and said, I'm a majority text guy. Oh, you shouldn't be saying text critics like Metzger and all these other guys are from Satan, but one of his own does it. And so they don't like it when we categorize them together and say, oh, well, you're part of his position, so you have to adopt what he's saying now, and you're guilty by association. They don't like that. They don't like it when we say, well, Westcott and Hort were doing this and that, and so you guys are following Westcott and Hort, so you guys should have the same thing. And it shouldn't be considered the same. Why are these guys putting us into the Anderson bag, Ruckman bag, and all the rest of it? It's just slander. So these guys are experts in slander, yet here they are teaching everyone what slander is.
There's a second form of speech we're commanded not to engage in that we've already guessed, and that's abusive speech. And so 1 Corinthians 6:9, know ye not that the righteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Be not deceived, be the fornicators or idolaters, like producers of mankind, speaking of homosexuality, and both of those primarily, nor thieves, covetousness, nor drunkards. Again, is it all a loiteros, that's the Greek word, is someone who uses speech that is highly insulting, abusive, reproach, or reviling. So someone who is a loiteros isn't necessarily saying things that are false, though often when you're engaging in this kind of abusive and insulting speech, you'll engage in falsehood as well. But technically, you could be a reviler, even if everything you say is true. But it has to do with someone who has, it not just that you speak strongly for the truth, but that you're just seeking to tear someone down and you don't care what means you used to do it. So just throw everything out there as abusive and destructive as you can be with your speech. That's Rhode Island. Another word is blasphemia, the idea of blaspheming, and it gets translated in Titus 3 as this. So Titus 3:1, put them in mind. This is what Titus is supposed to instruct the church. Put them in mind to be subject to principalities and powers, to obey magistrates, to be ready to every good work, to speak evil of no man, to be no brawlers, but gentle, showing all meekness unto all men. Speech that is denigrates or defames, reviling, denigration, disrespect, slander. These are just two of the words. There's actually other words we could go.
So this is where I disagree with Peter Montero's definitions here. You've got to take everything into context. And so, years ago, they used to have the "What would Jesus do" bracelet on, and what would Jesus do? But when people started really thinking about it, he would turn the tables over in the temple, and he was pretty full on at times. And so sometimes you're behaving like Jesus and all the Christians are upset with you. And it's like, I'm just doing what would Jesus do? He would turn the tables over. And one thing that I've been pulled over the coals with, and even, Timothy Berg's jumped in on this as well, is that they say, well, I only read like Matthew 23 when it comes to dealing with other people, because I'm like, well, isn't Matthew 23 part of being like Christ? Okay, so Matthew 23 is a whole chapter where Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees. He's rebuking the religious freaks of his day, probably the same ones who killed him. He's stirring it all up, saying, you're a bunch of liars, you're a bunch of hypocrites. He's just saying the truth. So according to Peter Montero's standards, Jesus would be committing slander. So this is ridiculous. And this is one of the things where it's pretty easy to see this. I can understand why, some people, that's why I don't like the whole, he's uncharitable sort of thing, because you just behave like Jesus and you're like, well, actually, I think this guy's a snake. He's a hypocrite. He's a whitewashed tomb. You're being Christ-like, and they're all upset with you. And it can be someone who's exemplifying the exact traits of the hypocrites and the scribes and the Pharisees, and they're two-faced, like someone like Billy Graham. Okay, Billy Graham, probably our last century, the greatest heretic of the last century. Okay, and lying through his teeth, saying that he agrees with everything that the Pope says. He said that in 1963. I've got quote after quote after quote of Billy Graham just being heretical. And he used to have ghostwriters writing books, and the books that were coming out were way more orthodox than what Billy would say in interviews. So many times he would say that atheists are already saved, Muslims are already saved, they just don't know it yet. And all this sort of strange, bizarre things. He didn't believe in a literal hell. Didn't believe fire was in hell, all this sort of stuff. And he was saying the Pope is the greatest evangelist the world's ever seen, and all this sort of stuff. He was a heretic. He was just absolutely off the wall. If he wasn't as famous as he was, if a guy like that turned up to your church, you'd be like, man, this guy's whacked. Get him out. But because he's famous, and one of the things is, if you win souls, you're untouchable. That's all you have to do to be a heretic and get away with what you're doing. Be a soul winner. To me, it's the same as Stephen Anderson. We're winning souls, and so people are like, well, at least he's going out winning souls, sort of thing. Oh, Billy Graham, but he's won so many people to Jesus, way more than you. You're the one judging, don't judge. And so these people, if Jesus turned up, would say, hey, Billy Graham, you whitewashed tomb, you hypocrite, you fool, you da-da-da. He was full on with these guys. You make people twice as much a son of hell as yourself. And so, Peter Montero is like, well, you can't do that. You can't say these things. Paul was very full on. He's like, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. May the Lord reward him according to what he's done. These other people did this and did that. He mentions, I think it's like 11 people by name. He names them and shames them. Demetrius, this and that, and John's talking about this, and so look at John in the Book of Revelation, Jezebel, this and that, he's talking about these people, and it's sort of like, well, apparently you can't even say the truth about people to defame them or anything. What? So am I engaging in slander against Billy Graham by saying that Billy Graham's a heretic and he believes things that are not biblical, and he's basically, a closet Roman Catholic? He wasn't even a closet Roman Catholic. He was openly saying that he agreed with everything the Pope said. In 1963, he said that, very early. And so, am I committing slander? So this is where I disagree with Peter Montero's Bible study. To me, this is, if I was in the church and I was the pastor and a youth leader did this Bible study, I'd pull him up and say, hey, I would just say what I just said. Jesus named and shamed lots of people. Hey, you scribes. Hey, you lawyers. Hey, you Pharisees. Hey, you this. Hey, you that. You're this. Said the truth about them. Straight to their face. Told everyone about them. And so how can you get away with that? And how can you get the Bible to contradict that? It's just, anyway.
To you, if we want to take more time, but this idea that speech that denigrates the characters of others, whether one, it should be true. Number two, there's a sense that it needs to be necessary and should be no more defamatory that is necessary for the defense of the truth.
Right.
So just attacking someone's reputation because you can or because it lifts you up is something that Scripture takes very seriously. There's a third form of speech that Jesus himself warns us against. Matthew 12:36, but I say unto you that every idle word men shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment. So the word translated as idle, it's the same word that refers to those who are idle in the marketplace. It's literally, this is lazy speech. This is the speech of those who are not being diligent, not willing to work, not employed in safeguarding what they're coming out of their mouth. And so if we're to sum this up, we are commanded to avoid false speech of all kinds. We're not to originate falsehoods. We're not to spread them. Even if the truth at our side, we're not to engage in abusive speech just because we think we're right. And we're warned we'll be judged for lazy speech. So it seems to me that the point of all of this is that we should never share memes on Facebook because they just, check all of these almost all the time. That was not entirely a joke, but not. But the point is that God takes falsehoods very seriously.
Yeah.
And he's especially concerned when our falsehoods cause reputational damage to our neighbors and reputational damage to our neighbors who are fellow believers in particular. So making false accusations against fellow believers is, in God's eyes, one of the sins he takes most seriously.
That's right. He didn't sit in the same list with homosexuality.
Yeah.
But they look you out.
Yeah.
It is that serious. It doesn't get any more serious than this.
Right.
It can absolutely destroy a church, destroy a person in the church.
Yeah.
Ministerially, I've seen it happen. I've seen the damage that can come from that.
Yeah. Well, and I might chime in to say, one of the things we don't maybe normally in the TCC talk about the really right-wing extreme crazies, and we've tried to, for the most part, I think, shoot at more moderate targets and intelligent, helpful targets. Yeah. And in fact, we normally speak more broadly of textual absolutism, whereas here we're really kind of specifically addressing that subgroup of King James onlyism. But one of the reasons we do so in sessions like this, and we think it's important, is specifically at this issue of slander, is we have a pastoral concern for people's souls. God's placed a charge upon us.
Hold the same view of New Testament textual criticism that we're.
Oh no, I've rewound it. Sorry about that. But at least it's the bit where Elijah Hixson says like two words and then, so I'm pretty sure it's back here. Sorry, I was just clicking on, Hannah said, I think the meme jab was directed at you, Nick. Yeah. Yeah, could be. As I have made a few memes about Mark Ward, and I stand by everything that's in those memes. If someone can show me where I've slandered the guy, man, I'll delete them. I'll publicly, I'll take out a full page ad in the New York Times and apologize.
Seen the damage that can come from.
Maybe normally in the TCC talk about the really right-wing extreme crazies, and we've tried to, for the most part, I think, shoot at more moderate targets and intelligent, helpful targets. Yeah. And in fact, we normally speak more broadly of textual absolutism, whereas here we're really kind of specifically addressing that subgroup of King James onlyism. But one of the reasons we do so in sessions like this, and we think it's important, is specifically at this issue of slander, is we have a pastoral concern for people's souls. God's placed a charge upon us to watch for their souls, and you guys each serve, in heavy pastoral ministry. And slander, I might disagree with my brother about a textual position. I might disagree with many of my good friends about the King James Bible, and some who are textual absolutists, if they wouldn't claim that title, what I would call them. But when it comes to this issue, it's not a matter of just I agree or you disagree about the text of Scripture. It's you're engaging in sin. You are sinning against God, and Christians cannot continue in impenitent sin. They must confess and repent. So we care about your soul, and we want to talk.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is particularly significant for pastors, because if you're a pastor, people will engage in the sin of slander against you. Sure, everyone who's listening to us, whatever your textual position, if you've engaged in serious pastoral ministry, you have felt abusive, slanderous, false speech towards yourself. It comes with the territory. And so for you to then turn around this thing that has been one of the heaviest burdens you've had to bear, and to just throw that out there towards others, and that's going to hinder your prayers.
Yeah.
And that's going to hinder your ability to even bring your burdens to the Lord if you're doing the same thing to others. That's really dangerous territory to be in, and that's my concern.
I reckon deep down, because I know like Timothy Berg's like, publicly, like, I don't slander the King James guys and all that. I think perhaps he's gone, well, Mark, you shouldn't really call them Ruckmanites. And Mark Ward's like, no, I'm keeping that video up. That's my video, and I'll call them Ruckmanites and blah, blah, blah. And maybe Mark Ward's gone, well, not only will we talk about the slander of the King James guys, but we'll bring up this issue, and hopefully Mark Ward himself will go, yeah, maybe I shouldn't call them Ruckmanites, and it's going to be a big repentance fest at the end or something. Like on the last video, it's like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't call them Ruckmanites. It's going to be like that, because it does seem like Peter Montoro sort of saying, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. And I sort of get the feeling that he's always preaching to someone in the room. It's weird. Helg says, it's an honor to be slandered by Mark Ward. Yeah, well, I mean, Jesus said let me get this up. So Matthew, version, of course. It says, blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. So that's, I'm glad, Ruckmanite, King James onlyite, Gippite, Rickling, Slandersonite, whatever you want to call me. My reward's great in heaven. Thanks, guys. I'm getting more. The more they slander me, the more I'm getting rewarded. So keep bringing it. It's like a fresh smelling bunch of flowers to me. A. Hannah says, right-wing crazies, textual absolutists. I don't know, maybe slanderous words. Yeah, it's because it's like, well, we're sort of dealing with the mainstream King James only, not the right-wing crazies, It's like, but we're part of that sort of same target, We could at any moment just become a crazy, Helg Everson says, it's almost like the test of truth. The one Mark Ward slander is closest to the truth on bibliology. The one Mark Ward slander. Yeah. It's if you want to be part of the TR club, you've got to be slandered by Mark Warden and the Textual Confidence Collective. You've got to be called a Ruckmanite. If you want to join our club, you have to have some footage somewhere of someone calling you a Ruckmanite, or sending it in an email, or proof your pastor, called you a Ruckmanite from the pulpit, or then you can join the Cool Kids Club. Until then, we're just sus on the outside, skull and bones. A. Hannah says, you're right, Nick. The Textual Confidence Collective is an intervention for Mark. Yeah, because I don't think Timothy Berg actually likes Mark Ward saying, because Mark Ward's like, I'm very charitable to everyone. I'm very lovely to everyone. These people are Ruckmanite. And it's like, he's very passive aggressive. We pointed that out. And we could just, all we have to do is go through his videos. Like, imagine someone going through his videos from the beginning. I actually started to do that, not his videos, but his writings. He actually mentions Westcott and Hort very early in his writings, like about 2010 or something like that, really early. And he's talking about Westcott and Hort and saying that people are saying bad things about Westcott and Hort. But there wasn't really any scholarly argument against it. It was just like it was almost like a tweet. But it'd be interesting to go through all of his writings right up until today and who he's spoken against. See, one of the reasons why my second video got blocked last time was because I played the Matilda clip. You know the Matilda clip where it's got Danny DeVito and he's there drinking a beer and the teacher's like, oh, we want Matilda to go to college. And, I've showed it in my Textual Confidence Collective videos a lot. But for some reason, I showed Mark Ward's video and mine got banned. It got blocked. And so I had to delete that section. So if you re-watch through that, the last 5 minutes, it just sort of, I'm building up to it, and then I go, see, he's slandering us and all the rest of it. But I was showing that to show the slander that Mark Ward has for us, because he's saying that we're just uneducated dimwits who are just mocking education. We're just mocking, we don't want to learn, which is, it's just so strange. And it's slander. It's basically slander. But Mark Ward can say that about us. And so I think Timothy Berg's actually aware that we are looking at Mark Ward going, he's a slanderer. He's a slanderer. And, it's quite interesting to watch. So let's continue.
And that really, in my old story, one of the things that turned me from the King James only as I was raised in, even at a relatively young age, that raised serious, questions, is so many of the voices I was being pointed towards were just
Sorry about that, guys. Just had a guy start mowing just out the back here, and so it was getting pretty loud. So I'll just rewind that, because Peter Montoro said that this was one of the reasons why he left the King James environment that he grew up in. Let's have a listen to this.
in my old story, one of the things that turned me from the King James only as I was raised in, even at a relatively young age, that raised serious, questions, is so many of the voices I was being pointed towards just didn't care about slander. And it was obvious to me the Bible did.
Yeah.
And in the King James that I was reading, the Brad James every day, and that the Bible cared about the actual truthfulness of the speech. And if we were to be the only ones who had the truth and everyone else was wrong, but we actually didn't care that our speech was truthful, and again, I don't want to say that everyone who's King James only doesn't care.
Right.
Sure. But there was that there. I want to be very clear. I don't want to engage in the sin of slander myself.
Right. Exactly.
But there were many who did, and there were many who were the ones others were looking to, that they were trusting, that were not using their speech in a trustworthy way.
Yeah.
So he was saying this is one of the reasons why he got out of the King James movement that he was in, etc. I can't. Sometimes it amazes me that people would actually believe or disbelieve something that's biblical, or a certain truth about anything, even if it's not biblical, a certain truth about something because of the way it's presented, or because of people advocating it. It's like, well, everyone who believed in a round earth, they were really rude. And so I thought, no, I'll believe in flat earth. Like you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't go, like he's basically saying people were King James only type of people, and they were saying untrue things. Well, it doesn't matter if they're saying untrue things or not. Truth is truth. Like I've heard people say really, really stupid things about the King James Bible. It hasn't deterred me from truth. It just makes me go, oh, they're saying stupid things. Like if someone said a really dumb argument for the Trinity, most people make dumb arguments. You listen to James White said that he would go from church to church teaching on the Trinity, and he would ask people to explain the Trinity, or he would explain it, and then he'd say, how many people agree with that and believe in the Trinity? They put their hands up, and he'd say, well, you're actually all modalists. Because most people don't understand how to defend the Trinity. And he would bring that up. So do we just go, well, do I say to myself, well, there's so many people who can't explain it and they're not being biblical. It's like, well, I'm just not going to believe it. You know, they're not using, you know, correct biblical argumentation, or they're making stuff up on the fly or whatever. They can't explain it properly, so I'm just going to not believe it. No, you believe something because it's true, regardless of if you're the only person on the planet. You're like, well, I can't see it any other way. This looks like truth to me. Now, one of the things is we can be embarrassingly wrong about things, okay? And I remember when I would have been 18 years old. I was going to the World Trade Center. This is where they had the Melbourne casino. So I grew up in Melbourne in Australia. So the World Trade Center used to have the casino in it before they built the Crown Casino, the big casino down there at the moment. And so I would go in there and play roulette. I had all systems worked out, and you know, I would go in there, spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars, go through, sometimes win, sometimes lose. But there was this one time I was pretty intoxicated, and I was at the table, and I was absolutely dead certain that I had put my money in a certain spot. It came in as a win. I've gone to collect my money, and this other guy's grabbed it. And I'm like, hey, hang on, that's mine. And he's like, no, that's definitely mine. And so they had a whole bunch of cameras in the ceiling, so they could look down at the wheel and look at who's putting what where. So the guy who was spinning the wheel just got on the phone, made a phone call, and he kept playing. And then after like 2 minutes, he just said, sorry, mate, it's not yours. And I was so embarrassed. I was like, how could I get something so wrong? Now, I was intoxicated, so that's probably why. But sometimes in life, I feel like that if I say something that's wrong, like sometimes even I'll just quote something and it's like, oh, actually, the guy who wrote that book got it wrong. And it's, oh, you know, and I feel like I cringe at myself sometimes, you know. That's why I try to avoid that type of thing and try to avoid going into kooky land, and because I don't want to be the cringy guy. I don't want to cringe at myself. I don't want to be the guy who says something and everyone's like, shh, you know. And if I ever do say stuff like that, please, you know, email me, contact me. Say, Nick, you're saying this, but it actually means this. You know, I mean, I've got blind spots. Everyone does. But at the end of the day, we can be wrong like that. And this is the thing. Here's Peter saying that he left the movement, the King James only movement, because people were saying certain things and all the rest of it. To me, that's just it's almost like he just doesn't want to be associated with a certain group of people. So he's actually adopted a whole bibliology based upon what other people are doing. And so I would just say to Peter, like, I know that's probably not the only argument that he has for it, but let's just rewind it and see exactly what he said here.
And in the King James that I was reading, the Brad James every day, and the Bible paired about the actual truth as I was raised in my territory to be in, and that's my concern. Sure, everything for past scripture cannot continue. And we want to talk about exactly. And I think this is particularly, significant for pastors, because if you're a pastor, people will engage in the sit of slander against you. Sure, everyone who's listening to us, whatever your textual position, if you've been engaged in serious pastoral ministry, you have felt abusive, slanderous, false speech towards yourself. It comes with the territory. And so for you to then turn around this thing that has been one of the heaviest burdens you've had to bear, and to just throw that out there towards others, and that's going to hinder your prayers.
Yeah.
And that's going to hinder your ability to even bring your burdens to the Lord if you're doing the same thing to others. That's really dangerous territory to be in. And that's my concern. And that really, in my own story, one of the things that turned me from the King James only as I was raised in, even at a relatively young age, that raised serious, questions, is so many of the voices I was being pointed towards just didn't care about slander. And it was obvious to me the Bible did.
Yeah.
And in the King James that I was reading, the Brad James every day, and that the Bible cared about the actual truthfulness of the speech. And if we were to be the only ones who had the truth and everyone else was wrong, but we actually didn't care that our speech was truthful, and again, I don't want to say that everyone who's King James only doesn't care.
Right.
Sure. But I want to be very clear. I don't want to engage in the sin of slander myself.
Right. Exactly.
But there were many who did. And there were many who were the ones others were looking to, that they were trusting, that were not using their speech in a trustworthy way.
Yeah.
So I'd want to say, someone like Gail Riplinger, who knows better, has been called out and has publicly said she doesn't care.
Yeah.
Or someone like D.A. Wadey, who purports to know better. And I don't know, but he proclaims and says that he has the competence to make these judgments.
Yeah.
But then he says things that are not true.
Yeah.
That he ought to know are not true.
Yeah. Blatantly false.
Yeah. And there are many others that could.
And so he did say about D.A. Waite there. So they do deal with D.A. Waite in their third video, which is already up. So I'll deal with that when we come to it.
Say ignorance only goes so far. Like, I'd say ignorance that has bad connotations, but there's nothing morally wrong with not knowing. We have to trust people.
Yeah.
It's just how life functions. I have a doctor's appointment when we get done and I go back. I have to trust my doctor. I'm not an expert at that, but at the same time, I'm not having a platform giving other people medical advice.
Right.
And at some point, trusting the wrong people who are doing these things becomes an issue of taking that upon ourselves.
Yeah. Well, and especially as Peter mentioned, raising that report, not just that I'm mistrusting someone who has knowledge that I don't in ignorance, but out of that ignorance to then attack someone's reputation is just a whole separate morally culpable issue.
Well, in all honesty, I don't see that much of it happening. Now, I know Riplinger's written a lot in her books. Ruckman's written a lot, but the vast majority of stuff that I'm dealing with on the internet and have dealt with since been on Facebook, I think since 2010, the vast majority of it is been moving away from that type of stuff. And someone will mention it and it's like, nah. And most people aren't really just going out there and parroting Ruckman, parroting Riplinger. I guess there are people doing it, but it's like in the circles that I'm in, we're trying to avoid that. It's like if we're in a creationist movement, we're trying to avoid the kooky, stupid arguments that have been made over the years. And it's like, no, we don't really use that argument here. Or, oh, yeah, that's an old redundant argument. And a lot of people who are involved with the Textus Receptus Academy would be people who are at the forefront of the Textus Receptus movement. And they recognize and understand, like I wouldn't expect any of these arguments to come from Peter Van Cleek, for example, or Jeff Riddle, it's not like this. Usually this is coming from Riplinger side of things, Sam Gipp, all that sort of stuff. And so, but we just sort of get thrown in the middle of it. Now, I know they've mentioned DA Way, but I'm just not sure because sometimes, like I just went through Peter Montoro's slander accusation sort of sermon. It's like, to me, I'm just like, man, like seriously, you're basically almost calling Jesus a slanderer. You know what I mean? Jesus, let me just get Matthew 23 here because it is about slander. This whole video is on slander, so I can't avoid it. And I've had people just say, "Oh, Nick, he gets his how to win friends and influence people from Matthew 23, sort of thing." But all I'm doing is showing this is a side of Christ that most people, if I was being loving and caring, they're like, "Oh, you're showing Jesus as values, and you're exemplifying what Jesus would do. Good on you. Pat you on the back. What would Jesus do? Bracelet on. Oh, well, Jesus would go and help someone, or Jesus would, if he's got 2 shirts, he'd give one away to someone who doesn't have one, and all this sort of stuff. Well, Jesus rebuked the Pharisees. So did John the Baptist. So did Paul. So you read through the Bible and you look for those things, you see it everywhere. So I'll just quickly read through this. Then spake Jesus to the multitude. Remember, this is Jesus. This is the main guy. Okay, just to remind you, refresh you, and spoke to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you to observe, that observe and do. But do ye not after their works, for they say and they do not. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, and they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries, and they enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the uppermost rooms at the feasts, and the chief seats at the synagogues, and greetings in the markets, to be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But be ye not called Rabbi, for one is your master, even Christ, and you're all brethren. And call no man your father upon earth, for one is your Father which is in heaven. Neither be ye called masters, for one is your master, even Christ. But he that is greatest among you shall be your servant. And whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that is humble shall be exalted. Listen to this. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up heaven against men, for ye neither go in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering to go in. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayer. Therefore ye shall receive the greater damnation. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye compass land and sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he is made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. Woe unto you, ye blind guides, which say, whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing, but whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he is a debtor. Ye fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifieth the gold? And whosoever shall swear by the altar, it is nothing, but whosoever sweareth by the gift that is upon it, he is guilty. You fools and blind. He's calling them fools, blind. For whether is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifieth the gift? Whoso therefore shall swear by the altar sweareth by it, and all things thereon. And whoso shall swear by the temple sweareth by it, and by him that dwelleth therein. And he that shall swear by heaven sweareth by the throne of God, and by him that sitteth thereon. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye have done, and not to leave the others undone. You blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you make clean the outside of the cup and platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind Pharisee, cleanse first that which is within the cup and platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, for you are like whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead man's bones and of all uncleanness. Even so ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within you are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. Woe unto you. Matthew 23. I could keep reading. It keeps going. And there are other places in Scripture where other times where he brought all that stuff up. So what would Jesus do? That.
Let's not forget that the very name Satan means accuser or slanderer. But we have to talk through a little bit more of the Bible's teaching on this. Let's actually, to take a step toward Westcott and Ward, let's talk about that other premise. Do heretical hands taint a Bible text?
Yeah, and I think what we want to really be careful on is we want to say, if we say, like, we're not accepting this accusation, that's going to be, dealt with in a later video. But if we say that heretical hands, or even reprobate hands of any kind, really is what the accusation is, that if you have unholy hands, for whatever reason they're unholy, whether false teaching, false living, if we want to say unholy hands contaminate a text, or even unholy associations contaminate the text, because that's really the way that this accusation is deployed, then we have to apply that consistently.
Right.
And we have to do so for a biblical reason. Deuteronomy 25, verse 13 and following, thou shalt not have in thy bag divers, that is, different weights, a great and a small. Thou shalt not have in thine house divers measures, a great and small. But thou shalt have a perfect and just weight, a perfect and just measure shalt thou have, that thy days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. For all that do such things, and all that do unrighteously, are an abomination unto the Lord thy God. So this idea that you have one measure for us and another measure for our enemies, again, this is extreme things that God hates, and he hates it when we have a double standard. And so we better not have a double standard. Whatever standard we have needs to be done consistently. And I want to say the concern to avoid compromise with evil that motivates many King James only defenders is commendable. Because there are these scripture verses like Galatians 5:9, a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump, will come out from among, don't have this one in my notes, but come out from among them, be separate, saith the Lord, touch not the unclean thing. These verses are in the Bible, and they do mean something, and we have to apply them, but we have to be careful that however we apply them, we can apply them consistently.
Right. And to our own proud, and not just we are distrustful of.
And we want to be careful that we don't contradict other scripture, because scripture is consistent. And that's the first slide, that in applying these principles of like a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump, that's Galatians 5:9, there are two aspects that we need to give attention to so that we don't end up with a double standard. One is that God can use anyone to accomplish his purposes, including very flawed individuals in both belief and in practice. So you have Samson, who was clearly flawed. He was not on God's agenda. And yet, he's clearly empowered by the Spirit. He's used by God. His faith is referenced in Hebrews 11. And I would argue, to give all the details would get beyond this, but that when Matthew talks about Jesus being a Nazarene, one of the things he's picking up on is a connection back to the Nazarite vow and Samson. And Samson dies with his arms outstretched in the middle.
I don't think that's a reference to Jesus having a Nazarite vow or anything like that. I think he's a Nazarene, but that's about it. It's just a place.
Middle of his enemies for his people. He's the only person in the Old Testament who does that. And it's an intentional connection to Christ. Samson with all his flaws, just like Jonah with all his flaws as a rebel prophet, these are used to point to Jesus. So God uses who he wants to, how he wants to. We could go even more extreme than a flawed judge or a flawed prophet. Isaiah 10, Assyria is described as.
So why don't we just accept what Marcion did, And the thing is, why? So wouldn't this apply to their? A lot of people say King James is a pedophile or homosexual, which the vast majority of King James TR defenders will say is not correct, and we've done a lot of research into that. But then it's like Othito Beza, he's this way, that way. Erasmus is a liar, and there's a lot of accusations that come against Erasmus, and so inadvertently, by saying this is coming against James White's position, which is like, oh well, Erasmus, he thought this and he thought that, therefore we can't take his text seriously. Okay, even though I would think that the vast majority of what James White says about Erasmus is easily disproven. But so unholy hands can be with the text and touch the text, and it's fine. So that means James White's argumentation against the text, because Erasmus, didn't believe the Book of Revelation was written by John, which it comes from Jan Kranz, his misinterpretation of the word olim in his book Beyond What Is Written. or the whole rash wager, rush to print type of scenario. We can just say, well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if Erasmus was a Muslim. If unholy hands can touch God's book, look, Samson, he was used. Other people in the Bible, they were used. So God can use, so maybe we should just do Muslim versions. Maybe we should do Satanist versions. Maybe we should all blaspheme the Holy Spirit and then do a version and just see how it turns out, because you know what I mean? It's like, it's just a strange position to be going into at this period of time when they're talking about slander and all the rest of it. It's sort of like, aren't they sort of saying that Westcott and Hort are good guys? So why are they going into this area where it's like, but even if they are good guys, bad people can do good things. It's like, but you're trying to say that Westcott and Hort are getting slandered. Then at the same time, you're saying, but bad people can do good things. So inadvertently, you're saying they're bad people. It's just so weird. Anyway.
The rod of God's anger. This is God's instrument of judgment. And it says, you don't think that's what you're doing. You have a totally different idea of what you're doing. You have your own agenda, but I'm actually using you. And this is my instrument to accomplish my purposes. And of course, you have Cyrus, who's God's servant. And the New Testament, I think, one of the most significant and relevant examples, Philippians 1:15 and following. Some indeed preach Christ even of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill. The one preached Christ out of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds. So there are these people that are preaching Christ in order to make the Apostle Paul feel more miserable. That is not a good motive, right? These are not good people that are doing this, right? But the other of love, knowing that I am sent for the defense of the gospel, that's a good motive. But then, notwithstanding every way, whether of pretense or of truth, Christ is preached, and I there do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. So Paul is able to rejoice in the preaching of those who are preaching in pretense to make his suffering more intense. And so that means then that this principle of not touching the unclean thing, a little leavening the whole lump, can't apply to who God can use to accomplish his purposes, that the work itself is contaminated. Because if it was, that would contradict all of these and many other, we could go for hours of all of these examples.
You could, but really was Samson doing a Bible translation? You know what I mean? Was he under the New Covenant? The Bible talks about the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. It's very different. And the Bible has certain standards. I mean, in the Old Covenant, only the Levites could do any type of copying of the Bible or anything like that. Now, kings were to do it as well. They were to write out the Bible. And so at least then they would know what the Bible said. But that's one of the reasons why we think the whole story about the Septuagint is, they had 6 from each of the 12 tribes. That's not biblical. The Jews wouldn't have done that unless they were in complete rebellion against the words of God, because only the Levites are supposed to work on the text. But in the New Testament, in a New Covenant setting, we would expect that people who are involved with text criticism would at least be Christians. So we can look at people who are non-Christians and go, like, historically, and go, okay, well, that was the type of text they were using. Okay, well, that's interesting. Or they believed in it. They had idolatry. They had all sorts of problems. But it's like we can look at their text and go, yes, that was good or that was bad or whatever. It's just a document in history. But to sort of say, like, it's okay for anyone to just work on the text, this is completely false. This is wrong. And because you can get someone who's a Jehovah's Witness, they'll sit down and they'll translate the text differently to what a Trinitarian would, because they've got certain biases and presuppositions that they're naturally going to put into that text, where someone with correct understanding of the text, correct presuppositions, are going to read the text properly and understand what's being said there and be able to, in context, define certain words a certain way. So it is very important who is doing it, especially when it comes to translation work. But Westcott and Hort were doing something even above that. They were working on the Greek text they were doing something which is very, very strange, getting Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and basically morphing them together as one text. So that's why we call it the Frankenstein monster, because it's never been seen before. They'd morphed these texts together, and they've done it by sort of voting, who thinks that this reading's better or who thinks this other reading's better. So just going through Vaticanus and Sinaiticus mostly, and just sort of who votes for that. If they've both got really silly readings, they might jump in and put a bit of a Byzantine sort of band-aid on it. But at the end of the day, it's this, to have that type of weight put upon Westcott and Hort and Unitarians who worked on the text. I just don't trust that. I don't trust anyone who's going to have Unitarians working with them. I mean, even if you're, let alone the Bible. The Bible is sort of like you're getting into the science of Christianity. You mix this little thing over here and you could have an explosion, So be very careful with what you're doing. At the end of the Bible, it's like, don't add or subtract from these words. It's pretty clear. And so people who do this work, you have to be very careful. You have to think about things a lot. You have to make sure that you're not putting into the text something that's not there. You sometimes will have to even go against some of your presuppositions because the text clearly just doesn't say that, but you want to squeeze it in. It's like, it's not saying that, So even translational work is a huge burden upon someone, and it would only really be relevant to someone who's a Christian, because they would be feeling the pressure of, the conviction of the Holy Spirit saying, hey, don't do it this way, don't do it that way. Let alone someone doing an underlying Greek text. I mean, that's a huge endeavor. And that's one of the reasons why I look at the King James translators and go, well, these guys, the vast majority of them, as far as I can tell, were living very good, holy, pious lives, and had good theology, in a sense where not perfect theology, but orthodox, not Catholic, not strange, not weird, not Unitarian. Not Westcott and Hort had strange doctrines, and they also had Unitarians working on the text. To me, that's just alarm bells are going already. I would never evangelize with a Unitarian. I wouldn't, like I said before, I wouldn't even have a Unitarian look after the nursery, or pass an offering basket around. Or you don't have even Unitarians in your church. You kick them out. That's what the Bible says. Don't have anything to do with these people. But they're doing Bible work. They're working on the Greek text with these guys. To me, this is just like, a 2-ton elephant in the room.
And the reason I picked these particular examples is there's no evidence that any of these people really repented. So you could say, well, God used, Paul the apostle, the persecutor. Well, Paul clearly repented. These groups and individuals, no evidence that they did. And yet there is evidence that God used them in a work that was not contaminated by their unholiness. And so here then is where the rubber meets the road. And this is really the pastoral concern here. Because if we apply this standard consistently to the text, if we say unholy hands at any point make the text defiled and unusable, it leaves us with no text at all.
Yeah, that's right.
So I guess the Jehovah's Witness text can be okay too. They could have just come up with all the good answers and we just haven't recognized it yet, because we've got this presupposition that we shouldn't allow Jehovah's Witnesses to work on the text, but apparently maybe their Bible is the best because God uses these wicked people, these heretics. So I just want to show you this book. So this is written by J. Green. It says this is an examination of 6 major new versions: NIV, NASB, NRSV, EB, the Good News Bible, and the New American Bible, NAB. And so they go, he went through and he's basically called it the unholy hands on the Bible. So he's examining a critique of Kurt Ahlen's text of the New Testament, And so this book, it's sort of available for like $100, which I doubt anyone would want to spend. But then you've got the David Cloud, an Unholy Hands. And I think this is going to download a book. Yeah. Yeah, Unholy Hands and God's Holy Book. So you can go through, maybe it's got Westcott. This text was produced by two members of the committee, Westcott and Hort, who preferred two Greek manuscripts. Maybe it does talk about George Vance Smith. I'm not really sure. But he does go through quite a lot of the differences between the texts. Now, I might type in Smith because he does usually deal with characters like Smith. Actually, it doesn't come up at all. But if you go to the Way of Life website, so I'll actually drop this into the people need to read this book. Okay, sorry, I put a little extra little thing on the end there. But if you just go to the Way of Life website, I'd encourage people to go there and just type in the search bar like Metzger or Westcott and Hort, and there's quite a lot of articles that will come up. Okay, so I'll just drop that down and let's just continue.
That's where this comes down to.
Yeah.
Because if we can't have a double standard, and Deuteronomy 25, this is very clear we can't, then Erasmus was in communion with the papacy to the day of his death.
That's right.
First edition of the TR. It's dedicated to Leo X, the very Pope.
Okay, so notice what he's done there. He's created a fallacy where he's saying, okay, Erasmus was in communion with the papacy until his death. Okay. And so the vast majority of Textus Receptus people go with the Textus Receptus edition that is underlying the King James Version. Now, just because something is named Textus Receptus, it doesn't mean that we have to agree with it. Like if someone produced a Textus Receptus edition tomorrow that had all different changes and stuff, I probably wouldn't go with it. But it's called the Textus Receptus. Then in 200 years, they're like, see, this TR edition, and they're talking about that. It's like, well, I don't accept that one. So the work that the Complutensian Polyglot guys did, the work that Erasmus did, and like say someone like Jeff Riddle, he says that he follows what Stephanus has done and what Theodore Beza has done, because these guys were Orthodox Christians. We would call them born again. I wouldn't agree necessarily with some of their views on Calvin or Calvinism, but I would definitely say that these were born again Christians. And so Erasmus, and when you read through David Cloud's material, he says Erasmus is not just, okay, well, he's 100% for the papacy and he's 100% against the Reformation. Well, in 1927, the Invalidoid in Spain, they actually did like a witch trial against Erasmus to see that if he had introduced Arianism into the church. And so that they were sus on him. After the Council of Trent, all of his books were put on the forbidden list. All of his books. He wrote against the papacy. He said that the previous pope was in hell. He had a book on that. And so it's not like he was just this faithful Roman Catholic guy. He was many times, when you look at, say, Tyndale had translated the Bible, which was the work of Erasmus, and he translated things like the Christian Soldier book. I can't remember the full term, but it was sort of like the ways of a Christian soldier or something like that. And it was Erasmus's work. He translated it into English. And so people point to Tyndale being the one who basically sparked the English Reformation. Or what did he do? He translated Erasmus's works into English, and there's Reformation. Martin Luther, he's translated Erasmus's text into German, starts seeing revival. And, you know, him and Erasmus, they weren't like at loggerheads. They were at loggerheads on certain points. But had Luther died before he got excommunicated, it would have been said that he was just a faithful Roman Catholic. Did you know that William Tyndale, he was considered a Roman Catholic priest until the day he died? When they strangled him, they defrocked him and said, you're no longer a part of the Catholic Church. Up until then, he was. He hadn't left the church officially, like, you know, I'm part of Luther's church or whatever. He had just, and a lot of people hadn't done that. A lot of people still, back then it was a Reformation in Europe. People were transitioning in and out of, you know, different groups and different, you know, there were certain Roman Catholic groups who were way more sympathetic towards a Reformation and they wanted things to change. Then there were, you know, the Spanish Inquisition. They're like, oh, we'll just cut off your hands and your head. And, you know, it was full on in some circles. And so you had things changing. And so here's Erasmus flowing in and out of all that stuff, being very critical of things in the church as well. So he's a very complex person. So you can't just throw him onto one team. Now, do I have to defend the guy? No. And as I've said, when you're involved with this type of thing, this is why we follow the text that is underlying the King James Version, because we understand that between Erasmus and the King James guys, there's 100 years of people examining, looking at things, looking at the Complutensian and Polyglot, looking at other manuscripts. Had they just followed Erasmus, Stephanus wouldn't have done his work, looked at a whole bunch of other manuscripts and worked on the text. Neither would have Beza. Would have just, let's just stick with Erasmus. That's it. He did a good job. But they didn't. They went through these things. They understood that something had begun there, but they're working through the text. They're ironing out issues, and they're getting to the point where you've got Orthodox believers, people who believe in the deity of Christ, people who believe in the Trinity, people who believe in salvation by the blood of Jesus, not by works of righteousness that we have done, not by, you know, going through Mary, not by going, you know, absolution through a priest or anything like that. They're orthodox in their beliefs, and they're looking at the text and they're ironing out these issues. And that's why we go with the underlying Greek text of the King James. So just because something is labeled Textus Receptus, it doesn't mean that everyone runs and gravitates towards that. Just because Erasmus has readings that are also later on accepted as genuine readings of the text doesn't mean that it's just, oh, that's just Erasmus made the decision and they're just blindly following it. You're looking at some of the greatest scholarship in Europe through Stephanus, through Theodore Beza, through Tremellius, through Junius, and the King James translators were very highly educated in these issues, and they made correct and accurate decisions upon the choices of the text. And so that's where I stand with it. When it comes to Westcott and Hort are actually getting a good text and they're deleting from it. They're looking at Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and trying to add and subtract from the Textus Receptus according to these manuscripts, and they're creating a mess. That they've actually destroyed this text, and they're using Unitarians to do it. That they themselves have been involved with seances and strange things like that. And so it's like, just say, for example, you had some very orthodox people who got the text of Westcott and Hort and said, okay, well, you know, they've done this. And just say no other text ever existed, but Westcott and Hort's text, all of a sudden, that's the Bible. And then you had very orthodox people come along and work on the text and go through it, and then they came up with a definitive text. It's like, okay, well, maybe I can look at that. But that's not what's happened. It's just gotten worse and worse till the point where Carlo Martini's involved, Bruce Metzger's involved, People like Ehrman, people like Wasserman, who doesn't believe in a literal hell, is involved. That these people are involved with the text and adding and subtracting. I mean, even the one reading that people don't want in the NA 28 is usually 2 Peter 3:10, the conjectural emendation, and that's the work of the CBGM. So how can you trust this new CBGM that Peter Gurry was trying to sell in the last video when it's making these type of errors that these guys want to delete from their Bible? They're embarrassed about it. It's not based upon any Greek text. And they're like, well, that's the, computer said this. And they're like, well, in 2032, I think it is, we're going to have a CBGM Bible. What with all those readings? You're already rejecting them. That's weird, So anyway.
Whose extravagant abuses provoked the Reformation. All the indulgences Luther was protesting against.
The papal bull against Luther.
Yes. Right. This is, and while, Erasmus certainly critiqued some of the abuses, he never separated from them, because he didn't want to be cut off from his sources of funding.
Yeah.
I mean, he was very
from his sources of funding. I mean, he wasn't making any money from the books that he sold. I think that is made up because he didn't want to change doctrine because of the sources of funding would have been cut off. No, I think him and Froben had a gold mine because of the text that they'd made. It was they were selling so many copies of it, and that was what was funding Erasmus for the rest of his life.
This wasn't ambiguous why he was doing this.
Yeah.
And then you could speak to this. Some of the Byzantine manuscripts we have, you have that.
So yeah, we have colophons,
and so we got Byzantine manuscripts with, this is dedicated to Mary or whatever, and some icons on it and all the rest of it. And so this is one of the reasons why I say to people, we don't just follow the Byzantine text. If you'd notice, even these guys say, well, the Textus Receptus is distinct from the Byzantine text. Yes, it is. They've used the Byzantine text as a type of base, but it is different. So, but the majority text movement is basing their text on the Byzantine text, which would be more like this is the text of the Orthodox Church. Okay, and so that's pretty much the conclusion that you have to make. So they're acknowledging that Protestants have gone through and tidied up this text.
that tell us about who wrote some of these manuscripts. Not always. Sometimes they didn't write one. Sometimes they don't survive. But, when I look at a manuscript and I see a scribe thanking Mary for giving them the grace to finish this book of the Gospels, I think that's probably not somebody who would be invited to preach.
Right.
And so what they're doing is they're conflating different groups of people. So if you have someone copying the text, they almost become neutral, like a Bible printer. So you can go to Zondervan, Zondervan, I'm pretty sure it was bought out by News Corporation, which is Murdoch. Murdoch's an Australian guy. We know quite a bit about him here. And Thomas Nelson, I think that got bought out by Murdoch as well. And so the New King James rights would be underneath him as well. And so I know James Murdoch mostly runs the empire now. But at the end of the day, when you've just got a printer, if they're printing the King James and it's a faithful edition of the King James, well, that's fine. I mean, you can have someone just copying the Bible out. I've had people work for me on my website, my Textus Receptus website, copying and pasting material. And I don't know everything about their spiritual life. I don't know where they're at. All I know is sometimes they're people who are in a third world scenario and they're asking for money. And I usually don't just throw money at people. It's like, well, you can work on my website. You can actually have a job working for me and I'll pay you. And so I'm paying them equivalent of what they would get as a normal job over there. So if they're saying, well, I can't find a job or I'm persecuted, well, then they have a source of income. And so I've done that for quite a long time with my Textus Receptus site. but I don't know where they're from. But I just know that they've copied and pasted the King James Bible in, or certain articles or certain things, and I read through it and go, yeah, that's fine. They've done a good job. It doesn't matter who they are, what they are. All they're doing is really just copying. And so he's saying that someone who was worshipping Mary copied the text, and then at the end said, "Thanks, Mary." Well, it's like, as long as it's just copied. Now, if they're making thousands of textual decisions and going, well, I think that this word shouldn't be here and that shouldn't be there, and let's just get rid of the last 12 verses of Mark and the Pericope Adulterae and 1 John 5:7, and let's delete this and throw this out and do this. Well, then you're going to go, hang on, who was this guy? Like a text like Vaticanus or Sinaiticus comes along, and you're like, who were these people who did this? Where when it's just a Byzantine thing, most of the time it gets regulated in the apparatus to just BYZ at the bottom of the page, or an M for majority text. It's usually cohesive with everything else. But this one says, "Thanks, Mary." So it's like, see, unholy hands. It's like, no, he's probably not making any textual decisions. He's probably just copying.
Yeah.
But that's who gave us the manuscripts that we have today.
Byzantine manuscripts. Yeah.
I just, I will share an anecdote. This is something that I'm not going to give the names, but a group of churches that I was familiar with growing up. So there was a man who started a church out of another church, and it was this is not mainstream for the Heartland movement. I talked about some of my background, but he was welcome in those circles. And so he started his church, and then he fell out of ministry. He committed a serious sin. And I found out afterwards that there was this belief in the church that sent him out, that bad seed can't produce good fruit. So it's basically applying this to ministry. And so they concluded that no one who had been gathered at that church had truly been converted or baptized.
Oh, wow.
And so all of them needed to be converted and baptized again. And I spoke with this wasn't like third-hand information. I spoke with the person that they had as the new pastor of the church, that we were supporting, that our church was supporting him financially. So this was, this is what he told me directly. And so, no, obviously bad seed can't produce good fruit. And so this idea that unholy hands contaminate the work, you take that to its logical conclusion, you try to apply it consistently. Now, here's where the story gets weirder, because the person who was the one who came up with that idea, who set him out, is now no longer in the ministry or following Jesus. So now how far back do you want to trace that? And I don't know the end of that. I've been out of the loop, but I just know, that he is in serious legal trouble and like really, really messy situation. And so you get this kind of idea. You get to a place where you have nothing at all, and you're basically tempting God with despair.
Yeah.
And I just think that's something that we ought not do. And of course, you'd want to say, I think a lot of people would want to say, well, you have this context of Erasmus and the Byzantine monks and all of these things. There's all of these extenuating factors that make them different from Westcott and Port, for example. And these are just bad dudes. But I think, again, if we're going to have a single standard, we've got to talk about the context of, 19th century Anglicanism, and that's where Tim's going to take us on.
So the thing is, too, what they're doing, the Roman Catholic Empire basically encompassed the whole of Europe. The Byzantine Empire was, all the way through, Turkey, a lot of Eastern Europe, into Egypt at certain periods of time, and so when you've got a blanket statement, like everyone's an American, imagine if I said everyone's an American Christian and they all follow Billy Graham's teaching because he's the most popular guy. People would go, no, we don't. The thing is, within the circles of translators and things like that, it was forbidden by the Roman Catholic Church to translate the Bible. So people who were doing so many times were in complete rebellion against the Roman Catholic Church. So Tyndale, he was killed for what he did. Luther, he was hounded for what he did. And other people who had attempted, we know the story of Wycliffe and the church was actively coming against that. So it's like me just saying, well, Pakistan's a Muslim country, and so they're all just Muslims there, and so there's no representation of anyone having an individual thought. So the difference is Westcott and Hort, their individual thoughts are driving them to what they're doing, where people like Erasmus, people like Luther, people like Wycliffe, people like Tyndale, people like or people who are working on those things, many times they're not just these are individuals who are under an umbrella. Okay, things are labeled in a certain way, and so I think had Erasmus been, in a certain different scenario, he might have been restricted in to do what he did, and so when you look at, and one of the things that I've said before, so this touches on the whole unholy hands on the text and everything. One of the main differences also between what's happened with the formulation of the Textus Receptus and the formulation of the Westcott and Hort text is you could get a Muslim to go back in time and go, okay, formulate a Greek text, and that they're around the time of Erasmus, and they just go to libraries, grab Byzantine text, formulate a Greek text, and it would be called the Textus Receptus because that's all they had. Now, the Vaticanus was sitting in the Vatican Library, rejected. And that's all they had. Complutensian guys make a text. It's pretty much a TR text. Yes, there are differences, but it's like that's pretty much the same type of differences that we see in some Byzantine readings, But usually everyone is like Byzantine's pretty cohesive, That's why they regulate it to just BYZ at the bottom of the page. Usually in the apparatus, it's like, well, they're cohesive. So you could get a Unitarian to go back in time and go, hey, work on the text. I'm not talking about translating. I'm talking about compiling. And they go like, okay, grab all these texts and just work it all out. And it's like, there we go. And it would probably be considered a TR text. The difference is you get to Westcott and Hort's time, they're using Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, these two manuscripts that anyone who's worth their salt, their weight in salt, like someone like D.A. Waite, someone like Dean Burgon, I get them confused because he ran the Dean Burgon Society. Dean Burgon, he was, he looked at these manuscripts and he said they're hopelessly corrupt. That they're horrible manuscripts, just like Codex D. Everyone recognizes Codex D as a corrupt manuscript. So why don't we recognize Vaticanus as a corrupt manuscript like John Mill did, like Erasmus did? People who know that and understand and have skill in manuscripts and learning and things like that, they recognize this as a corrupt manuscript. Sinaiticus came on the scene. People like, this is a horribly corrupt manuscript. But what they've done is they've just put these two together. Now, it wouldn't matter if you had an Orthodox guy do that, or a Unitarian do that, or a witch do that, or a Muslim do that. You're going to come up with horrible readings. What else can you come up with if you're trying to mash two perverted texts together? You're going to come up with something terrible. And so the difference is that they created a text that's never been seen before. When you go back to the formulation of the Textus Receptus type of manuscripts, that's all that was available. That's all that they had, because that's all that there was. And they recognized corruption in manuscripts like Vaticanus. And they were like, that's rejected. Everyone rejected it. The Protestants rejected it. The Catholics, everyone. And so the only real difference was the Catholics had their Latin Bible and the Protestants had the Greek. They said the Greek is the primary text. But the thing is, they still agree that the precope adultery should be in there. They still agree the last 12 verses of Mark in there. 1 John 5:7 should be in there. I think if the Catholics looked at the horrible Frankenstein monster that's been created in Westcott and Hort's time, they would be cringing and saying, oh, look at what happens in the future. Look at this terrible text. Because even Beza and others, they were fighting and loggerheads with the Roman Catholics over them just following the Latin. But most of the time, the Latin, it's not half as bad as the Westcott. Westcott and Hort text is just like an absolute abomination. And so, but the Catholics have adopted that now. Right? The Jehovah's Witnesses, they adopt it now. Lots of groups have adopted it as the best. So what was the worst in the Reformation period has now been elevated as the best. And what was the best has now been turned around to be the worst.
Yeah, so we need to, if we're going to rightly assess them the way we would want to be rightly assessed, we need to kind of understand the era that they wrote in. And it's admittedly difficult for us as part of the free church tradition to get our minds around what Anglican theology and controversy looked like, especially back in the Victorian era. We might think, well, the Victorian era is not so long ago. There's even, early forms of what we might call a photograph that we can look back at. That's just a few years ago, right? So it's really close to us. We understand it. But actually the opposite is the case. Colin Matthew, a major Victorian historian, made this point really well. He said the 19th century is often assumed to be easy to understand because it's chronologically close. But that period is now far distanced from us. And the 19th century, in terms of its mindset, is in fact one of the centuries most alien to the modern mind. So it actually takes a lot of historical work, even though we're not going as far back in time as maybe the Reformation or the early church. There's such a different shape to the theological controversies and to the shape of the Victorian church that we just have to kind of step back for a minute and try to read that broader history. So let me try to do that for us real quick. First, of course, we're talking about Anglicans, right? Westcott and Hort and Scrivener and Burgon. These are all people serving in the Anglican church. So what is Anglicanism? Well, Anglicanism and the Church of England come about as a product of the English Reformation in the 1530s. We're familiar, of course, with Luther nailing the 95 Thesis, or probably, I think, mailing the thesis to be nailed. But somebody nailed the 95 Thesis, and in Germany and on the continent, the Reformation sweeps across Europe as a primarily theological movement about the authority structures of the church and the Bible, and about the means of forgiveness and justification, huge theological issues. Well, when the Reformation comes to England, it comes via King Henry VIII, wanting to get a divorce or annulment from his wife, Catherine. And this Reformation thing is taking place over there. And he really likes Catholic theology. He doesn't believe in justification by faith. He's written strongly and ferociously against Luther and been named the defender of the faith. Yeah, but he says, well, now the Pope won't give me a divorce, so I guess I'll switch sides, but I don't really like their theology. So he becomes essentially a pope over the church in England, and says, actually, they were right about some things, but instead of the Pope being in charge, the king is. So I'm in charge. And you get a church that it takes several decades for this to develop, but eventually what happens by the 1620s, you get a church that is essentially Protestant in its theology, but Catholic in all of its liturgy. It still has priests, it still has bishops. It's the only Protestant church that still has episcopacy and a bishopric system, at that time at least. And it has this written liturgy. We read, a prayer earlier. That's what church service looks like for them. Morning prayer, evening prayer, very closely scripted worship. So it's a Protestant church, but it's really hard for us outside of that tradition to get our minds around it. In terms of the way that the Anglican church kind of divided theologically, there were basically three parties. Not everyone was a part of any of these parties, but three parties sort of developed in the Victorian era. What we call the High Churchmen, and there've been high church strands all the way from the time back to Lancelot Andrewes, right? This idea that the church fathers would be really highly respected. Specifically, the bishops are the successors of the apostles and bear apostolic authority. So church authority in the episcopate has this massive function that's been around for a long time, and it's still present in Victorian England. But then what also develops as a result of the revivals is kind of a low church party that disagrees with some of those ideas, disagrees especially with some of the high view of baptism, because now we've got people preaching that you need to be born again. Wait a minute, I thought I was baptized as an infant. All Anglicans baptized as an infant, right? But now I believe I have to be born again as an adult. So where is regeneration located? So you get kind of a strand of the Victorian church that has a lower view. Yes, Peter.
I want to throw in, just going back to Henry's Reformation, that you have a certain degree of top-down Reformation, and he's very influential. And Henry sees himself. There's been a recent historical work done on Henry's Reformation that he sees himself as reforming the church. So he's not just trying to carry on the medieval. So you've got his desire for divorce, but Henry really thinks of himself as a theologian and as a reforming theologian.
Yeah.
But then you have the bottom up work from the beginning of people like Tyndale,
that's right,
and others who were really preaching, so that the low church wing isn't just something that comes in later, but people who are genuinely evangelical in theology are there from the beginning. And then you have those who are unhappy with Henry, but also unhappy with being dead. And so you have that continuing Catholicism.
Yeah.
And then Cranmer, that middle range. So you have these things coming in, not just developing later. And then, not to say, but
I agree.
you have this streams coming in a way that you really have a plurality of actual reformations in a way that's a little distinct from, say, the Lutheran or say the Reformed Reformation in Switzerland.
Yeah. And because Henry's 3 children went different directions with the throne, that it's a topsy-turvy, ugly mess for how it develops, because you get a thoroughly Protestant young son, but only reigns for a few years, and then a thoroughly Protestant Catholic daughter, and then a Protestant daughter who realizes, man, there's people on both sides of that, top down and bottom up. Sorry. They're anti-Protestant. And then with Elizabeth, you get what we call the Elizabethan settlement religion, where she kind of is the one that builds this church that says, okay, I'll be Protestant in all my theology, except maybe some of my ecclesiology, but I'll be Catholic still in some of my liturgy. And it's kind of the middle ground that's found for the Church of England. So you've got then, as it develops in the Victorian era, that high church party, some strands of that low church party that are now developing, influenced by the evangelical revival. And you also get, because of the criticism, historical and biblical criticism that's taking place in Germany, as that comes into England, you get a group that begins to refer to themselves as the Broad Church Party. They're essentially what we call the liberal wing of Anglicanism. So there's these 3 big parties in the Anglican Church at the time: high church, low church, and broad church. They're all kind of arguing with each other for Anglican identity, who really represents the face of Anglicanism. And there are people that don't really fit in any of those molds exactly. So let me just real quick run through a couple of the essential historical moments that shape that. Of course, the revivalism of the First and Second Great Awakenings, this emphasis on personal conversion and therefore question about regeneration. Where does it happen? Is it in baptism? That's what our formularies say. But now we're also claiming that someone has to personally trust in Christ and be born again, and that's regeneration. So there's difficulties there. Then you have the Oxford movement that develops in the 1830s. John Keble preaches a sermon called National Apostasy and claims that in the midst of this struggle for Anglican identity, liberalism is overtaking the church, and the secular elements of the church are exercising too much control, especially in Ireland, cutting down the number of bishops. And the real answer is to find Anglican identity in patristic sources, in that ceremonial ritualistic liturgy. And so they re-emphasize kind of the Roman Catholic element. That takes its biggest expression in what's known as the Tracts for the Times. I have John Henry Newman's here, or most of his, selection of 90 articles, some of them almost books, that get published over the course of the next decade, that's trying to recover that high church, almost Anglo-Catholic strand. So that takes place, and it's there opposing, understand, liberalism, firmly opposing liberalism. A lot of the people that write about Westcott and Hort don't seem to understand that the broad church and the high church or Tractarian element, they are not the same movement. They are utterly opposed to one another. They are debating and fighting with each other. Then, of course, you get a massive scientific revival when Darwin's Origin of the Species is published in 1859. Now people are asking for the first time really serious questions about how science and faith relate to each other. Yeah, cosmology, where does the world come from? And then right in the midst of that, the broad church movement finally creates kind of a manifesto known as Essays and Reviews, publishes it in 1860. They were called at the time by many people who didn't like them the 7 Against Christ, because what they've done, especially Benjamin Jowett in his chapter on the interpretation of Scripture, they've come along, accepted the criticism from Germany, and said, you know what, actually, the Bible's not even an inspired book. God doesn't speak in it. It's not really from God. It's just like any other book, and it should be interpreted like any other book, which is Jowett's big phrase. Causes
Wow, that's like most text critics today.
a firestorm from the high church and the low church parties, including John Burgon, who we've mentioned before, who ends up preaching 7 sermons to match the 7 Against Christ, called Inspiration and Interpretation, furious that they would interpret the Bible like any other book. So all that movement's going on, and at the same time, economically and politically, you have the economic revolution taking place, the Industrial Revolution, and this optimism, the Great Exhibition of 1851. We've really finally come to the pinnacle of human achievement. They, of course, had no idea that a world war was a few decades around the corner, but from their perspective, man, we're at the place where humanity's never been here before. We're learning more about science, learning more about health. We finally figured out that if you wash your hands, maybe people won't die as you're a doctor. Like, that's this massive thing that takes place. So why not apply that to the biblical text? People have been calling for a revision of the Bible. Science and the study of the science of textual criticism has advanced. So, of course, there's a call that we talked about in the last session for a revision of the King James Version that is decided in 1870 and 71, and then is worked on until 1881. All of that is going on in the context in which we're going to stop and try to assess Westcott and Hort. So the question is, where do they fit in all that? where were Westcott and Hort? Well, they both regularly stated, we don't fit in any of these three big parties. They felt those were schisms. Those were attempts within the church to cut other people off from the church. So they didn't directly identify with any party, but basically, I think we could suggest that Hort was pretty close to a high churchman in his theology, and Westcott pretty close to a low churchman, but they each had sympathies with each of the other wings. And let me explain what those sympathies were. Hort was specifically sympathetic to very many broad church concerns, especially their freedom to think and speak independently. But understand, he opposed the movement's rejection of orthodoxy. He held very firmly to the creeds and opposed their rejection of creedal Christianity that affirms the Nicene Creed and all that orthodoxy there. He didn't like the Athanasian Creed, but he affirms the Apostles' Creed. So he opposes that, but likes their...
would be things like the deity of Christ and the resurrection and these things that, for those who aren't as familiar with the creeds.
Yeah. We don't recite them, of course, in our circles, but they were...
So he's reciting the creed and then hanging around with George Mansfield. So he's a hypocrite.
Reciting them daily, and he firmly affirms them, believes in them, holds to that orthodoxy, so disagrees with the broad church party at that point. Both of them also had some disagreements with the broad church party about biblical authority. Jowett's coming out and claiming the Bible's not inspired. They both intended, together with Lightfoot, to write a massive response to the essays and reviews called Faith and Reason, where they were going to argue that the opposite was the case, that the Bible was thoroughly inspired, but that scientific and historical criticism could play its role. So they're opposing some high church concerns, opposing some broad church concerns, and opposing some low church concerns that don't fit exactly in any of those wings, but essentially were from the aspects of their times. I think we could say orthodox in their creedal theology, even if we'll see Hort had some really unusual ideas when we start to look through some of the specific slanders and accusations. Some of them are true, and Hort had some theology that we maybe wouldn't be uncomfortable with. But they lead us to a place that I hope we can helpfully understand. Let me maybe make an illustration that I think will wrap it up for us and kind of place them on the map, because it's hard for us to place Anglicans on the map. I think, and this isn't a perfect analogy, but I think we could probably similarly compare F.J.A. Hort to C.S. Lewis. He's an Anglican bishop, has some strong high church sympathies, but has some really questionable views about inerrancy. C.S. Lewis doesn't accept inerrancy. Hort was willing to kind of provisionally affirm infallibility, but didn't want to proclaim it as doctrine. Still accepts some form of inspiration. And again, the parallels aren't exact. Had some reformulations of the doctrine of hell. So some things were going on there that we might say, hey, that's heterodox, at best. But also a positive influence, most people would say, and I think most of our listeners would say, from much of the church.
Sorry, I just missed that little bit because I'm trying to look up some things on the side.
Didn't want to proclaim it as doctrine. Still accepts some form of inspiration.
Who he was just talking about.
Similarly compare F.J.A. Hort to C.S. Lewis. He's an Anglican bishop, has some strong high church sympathies, but has some really questionable views about inerrancy. C.S. Lewis doesn't accept inerrancy. Hort was willing to kind of provisionally affirm infallibility, but didn't want to proclaim it as doctrine. Still accepts some form of inspiration. And again, the parallels aren't exact. Had some reformulations of the doctrine of hell. So some things were going on there that we might say, hey, that's heterodox, at best. But also a positive influence, most people would say, and I think most of our listeners would say, from much of the church. And I think Hort could be seen that way.
Okay, so Hort had some issues with hell. I've just got to go back over that because that's quite a big admission here.
So some things were going on there that we might say, hey, that's heterodox, at best. But also a positive influence, most...
Sorry, I didn't go back far enough.
Views about inerrancy. C.S. Lewis doesn't accept inerrancy. Hort was willing to kind of provisionally affirm infallibility, but didn't want to proclaim it as doctrine. Still accepts some form of inspiration. And again, the parallels aren't exact. Had some reformulations of the doctrine of hell.
Reformulations of the doctrine of hell. Okay, so that's interesting. We'll keep that in mind when we're still going through.
So some things were going on there that we might say, hey, that's heterodox, at best. But also a positive influence, most people would say, and I think most of our listeners would say, from much of the church. And I think Hort could be seen that way. Westcott, much more firmly orthodox in his recitation of what we would today call evangelical Christianity. He didn't like the word evangelical, but he thoroughly supported the resurrection of Jesus, the deity of Jesus, the inspiration of Scripture, the infallibility of Scripture, the preservation of Scripture. And I would be comfortable having him come and speak at our church, even though I disagree with him. And I think we could put him in a similar category as like an N.T. Wright. Kind of broadly evangelical, maybe doesn't like the term, doesn't want to get involved in all the debates that sometimes evangelicals like to argue about in terms of penal substitutionary atonement, debates about inerrancy. But broadly, I think we could respect as a scholar that we can trust to defend creedally orthodox Christianity. So
NT Wright. And so anyway, I have access to a lot of audio books through my subscriptions, and I've made those mistakes of getting into NT Wright's books, and it's like listening to a Mormon. It's so dead. And so anyway, I'm just going to pull this page up just for a second. We haven't actually got long to go in this video. It's like 3 more minutes. So the Jehovah's Witnesses, they actually have a whole bunch of material on the inspiration of God. The Bible, is it truly inspired of God? Do you believe that the Bible is from God, or do you believe it's a book that pertains purely thoughts from men? That's an ongoing debate, even among professed Christians. For instance, in a 2014 Gallup poll in the United States, it revealed that the majority of nominal Christians agree that the Bible is connected in some way to God. And so it goes in through what is inspiration. So this is on jw.org. So I was thinking this the other day when I was listening to the audio of this. I thought, they're going like, they believed in the resurrection. They believe in inspiration. I'm like, Jehovah's Witnesses believe in inspiration. They believe in the resurrection. I know there is a difference in the resurrection of the body or the spirit and all that sort of stuff. But it's like, when it comes to these biblical topics, half the time it's see, the thing is, you can say someone believes in the resurrection, but then it comes down to the details. So this is the thing with the Mormons. Oh, we believe in the Trinity. Yeah, they believe in 3, but it's very different to the Trinity that you and I believe. And so you've got to be careful with people just blanket saying, oh, they defended the resurrection. Okay, well, there's 50 different types of resurrection out there. Which one were they defending? You got to be very careful with just, oh, they defended the resurrection of Jesus. It's like, well, and this is the thing with Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman will bring up, lost Christianities or different types of Christianities and all this sort of stuff. But oftentimes, all he's doing is putting things into certain categories and saying, well, this is a Donatist way of looking at God. This is an Arian way of looking at God. This is a Sabellian way of looking at God. This is a modalist way of looking at God. This is a Trinitarian way of looking at God. There's probably 50 different ways that you can look at the Godhead. But sometimes people say they're Trinitarian and they're not. Sometimes people say they're modalists and they're not. Or they get attacked as being a modalist, but they're actually not. And it's quite interesting. But so anyway, you go through the Jehovah's Witness material and they defend inspiration. All scripture is inspired of God. The phrase inspired of God translates the compound Greek theopneustos, meaning literally God breathed or breathed by God. This is the only occurrence of the Greek term in the scriptures. It here clearly indicates that God as the source and producer of the sacred scriptures. I mean, if I was reading the life of Westcott and he had a thing on inspiration like that, I could quote him saying that. This is from jw.org. So what they're saying about Westcott and Hort is not remarkable at all. Jehovah's Witnesses believe this sort of stuff. It's, I just, they've got to raise the bar a little bit, And everything that Timothy Berg said about the Anglican Church, it's like interesting history. Maybe he's studying to do that. Maybe he's writing a book about the King James Bible or something, and that's part of it. But it's sort of like, it's not really fitting in. It was just sort of like, I've got my 5 minutes, and I'm gonna hit him with this, and it's sort of like not really that relevant to the whole thing. I can't see much relevance anyway.
I think that kind of helps us put him on the map a little bit, and we'll talk about specific issues in our next session.
That next session will take place either virtually or we'll figure out something. And that's kind of like the late Garrett San Antonio. And I think what's really important to end here with is that, we started with a long pushback, a biblical one against slander, right? We're trying to set up an accurate representation of Westcott's and Hort's views. But that did not stop you, Tim, who've done the most work of all of us on their views, from mentioning things that you disagreed with.
That's right.
And even saying, I'm not so sure I'd want this individual to be preaching in my church. So to stop short of slander does not mean to stop short of disagreement.
That's right.
It means to accurately report.
Right.
Yeah, and that's what charity demands.
Yeah.
When you disagree with someone, when someone disagrees with me, I just want them to say what I said. Just try to represent my viewpoint in terms that I could affirm. Westcott and Hort, that they receive a level of slanderous accusation, which is just incredible.
Yeah.
We're going to get into
Unlike anything I've ever seen.
It seems as
King James is a pedophile, homosexual. Nearly every book about the translators, it's like King James had his favorites, you know. It's so ridiculous, and I've never seen anything like that. I mean, you know, we're going to go through apparently all these slanders about Westcott and Hort, and because, you know, we've got a minute to go, and really what I want to do is I want to just sort of quickly jump onto D.A. Waite's book.
if many defenders of the exclusive use of the King James Version have pinned a ton of the weight of their viewpoint on this one set of premises that we've talked through, and then therefore on a set of ideas about the way Westcott and Hort were. So we promise we are going to get into these details. Quite obviously, we can't stop here. We have set ourselves up for a longer discussion, but we've done the homework. You know, we're going to actually quote Westcott and Hort, try to canvass their views in a way that is charitable and accurate, even when, as today we disagree. Yeah. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next time on this exciting YouTube channel, full of all kinds of Bible nerdery for more discussion of Westcott and Hort and the slanders against them. Thank you guys for coming out. And I want to thank, I won't name the church here in San Antonio for hosting us here. And it's been a real delight. So thank you again. See you next time.
Okay. So I'll just shut that down, and I'll just move over here, because what they do in the next video, they bring up Floyd Nolan Jones, a quotation about Westcott and Hort, and then they bring up something that D.A. Waite said about Westcott and Hort, and they sort of say, well, you know, this is really poor scholarship. It's borderline slander, or it is slander. And so they actually talk about a certain text. Was it John 5? I'm just trying to remember here. John 5. Anyway, perhaps as part of this series, I might go through this. It's quite a long theological examination of the heresies of Westcott and Hort. And so let me just go through from the beginning. It's called The Theological Heresies of Westcott and Hort as Seen in Their Own Writings by D.A. Waite. Okay. And he's got, I think it's like 50 pages. Yeah, it's 50 pages exactly. So there's quite a lot of information here. Now, they're saying he got one thing wrong. But then they were saying, well, there are a whole bunch of other things that he says which is not true, blah, blah, blah. But they do point out one thing specifically that they were saying comes against the deity of Christ and the Trinity, and that he's saying, basically he's saying that Westcott and Hort were redefining words and being sneaky about their heresy. And so I think what I really need to do is read through this article and point out some of the things. Maybe instead of me personally reading this, I can go through and actually read this online. I guess I'd need permission from D.A. Waite to do that. if not, I can just go through and look at the things that are relevant. I mean, but it would be an interesting video to have. It would probably take me 2 videos to do it, to read through it, but maybe I should just skip through it and just go to the ones that they're talking about. But the problem is you can tell in amongst this that they're using type of words, like say Westcott and Hort claim the messengers were inspired rather than their words. So this is one of the things that I've often brought up. When they were writing the words of God, the words became inspired, not the person is inspired in a sense of they're like a pope, you know. Now, I know the prophets spake as the Holy Spirit moved them, but it was their words that were inspired. It wasn't so much them, okay? It wasn't like they went through their whole life being infallible, or, you know, that John could just walk along and just, you know, he could, whatever he wrote was just of God, like a pope, you know, sort of thing. It's the words are inspired by God. So D.A. Waite makes some very distinct comments, and he has a very interesting way of looking at things that could be even at loggerheads with other TR people. But he, knowing doctrine and knowing a lot of things about theology, wants to be very specific. And so I'm going to put this link, because this is just online. So all, you know, this book is just appearing online, so someone's got it there. I'll throw it into the comments. I'll just read some of these comments, actually. History Documents says, can Timothy tell us why Westcott and Hort made the 1881 Translation Committee swear to secrecy? So that would be an interesting thing to look at. He also says the backwards indoctrinated liberal theology of the TCC is like a dog chasing its own tail. These guys are just spinning in their own nonsense. It's sort of like that. You wonder where they're going with all this, you know. That is, they'll spin it to their perspective and narrative. Yeah, I think that any type of historical claim that they're making, they're heading in a certain direction, but it's like, why are you heading in this direction with that? But then at the end, it'll all come out and be like, that's why they're laying the groundwork for this and for that, because they have this big claim at the end or whatever. But we'll just have to go through their videos. What I'll do, we've just finished the second one, so there's a third one already out, and so that's going to be the next one that I do. I'll put everything else on hold. We're not going to do any eschatology videos or any Ehrman videos or anything. We're going to keep going through this, but I won't be able to probably do that today, maybe tomorrow morning here. So it'll be about the same time as this one, I think. So I've gone for about 3 hours already. So Helg says, push back against slander, starting with the slander coming from Mark Ward's videos. It seems they can slander TR KJV defenders, but do not touch the sacred cows of the critical text. Yeah, see, their slander is different. See, they're right, according to them, and so they can slander us because we're just hillbilly idiots. And they're in their ivory towers of scholarship, and so they are the highbrow people. So they're looking down on us poor peasants with our stupid TR and our stupid King James, and they have pity upon us, but they're sort of in the background, like, for those idiots, you know. So they can mock us, they can slander us, they can call us Ruckmanized. We're easily swayed just by a guy called Ruckman. You know, he can come along and say what he says, and we're just like zombies following a cult leader, apparently. And Ripplinger brings out a book, and we're just all like, yep, whatever she says is correct. Now, I've done videos sometimes where I look at Ripplinger's material. She'll have like a 10-point thing, and I'm like, I agree with 2 points. The rest of them, they're silly. You know, and even Joseph Armstrong, he has a channel called the Bible Version Conspiracy, and he's sort of he runs the page Friends of Gail Ripplinger on Facebook and all that, and he does the same. He'll look at things and go, actually, I disagree with her on that. Actually, I disagree with her here, and here, and it's like, I'm just thinking, yeah, that's why sometimes we say that some of the things she's writing is a bit kooky. It's a bit over the top. She's reading into things. She's already got a conclusion, and she's trying to squeeze everything into that conclusion. Got a presupposition there. So yeah, D.A. Waite's book, very interesting, because this is one that they say is, horrible, and D.A. Waite should have known better and all the rest of it. Now, with Floyd Nolan Jones, he the first time I experienced his work was a book on the Septuagint, which I would still recommend, but with the caveat that he is in a sense a follower of Ruckman. And so it's a bit like, you do get people who have followed Ruckman who can have a very interesting opinion on certain works and other things. But I would just be careful with that he does mention Ruckman in a lot of footnotes. And so he is getting information from him, which I wouldn't personally do. But the thing is, too, if you go to my website, I look at James White, I look at Dan Wallace, I look at Metzger, I look at Ruckman, I look at Ripplinger, I look at everyone, because I don't want to leave anyone out. And if Ripplinger's wrong and Ruckman's right, it's like, okay, I just state that. But it's not like I'm on anyone's team or I'm supporting anyone. I'll say, well, Metzger's right here, James White's right there, or they're wrong here, or they're wrong there. Whatever's true is true. Yeah, so I think I should really end this now. Okay, so maybe I'll just grab the video back up. We'll go back to Mark Ward's channel. Okay, so these are the recent videos. So we've gone through this one. We just examined this one. So this is the common lies about Westcott and Hort that came out at the same time.
Spiritualism, like.
So that goes for an hour and 5 minutes. So that'll probably be 2 videos from me. But yeah, they go into Theodore Letis, which will be interesting. When I listened to it yesterday, it's sort of like, Theodore Letis is saying, oh, Gail Ripplinger's book is rubbish, just like James White's book is rubbish. And it's like, that's pretty much where we would be at. Where most people in the TR Academy are saying that type of thing. Most people who frequent my channel say that type of thing. And so...
Welcome to another video in the textual
we'll begin to go through this, and one thing that I really should do actually is look at the comments, because I'm sort of looking for where to go next. Maybe I should look at the first video and just zip through some of the comments, the second video, and then we'll shut it down from there. So that'll give us maybe another 10 minutes. If you do want to join in, StreamYard
and apostates.
I've still got the StreamYard link there if anyone wants to jump in. But let's go through here. So 123 comments. Okay, ones that are just, hey, Mark, this is the best thing that's ever happened since sliced bread. I'm just not going to read them. I'll skip through them. These are very important videos, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this guy says, thank you for your discussion. I largely agree. John 1:18 has an interesting test case, one of Hort's dissertations. The RV did not follow Westcott and Hort, nor had Tischendorf, despite his use of 1 and 4 and 019. Also, SBLGNT, sounds like the ABCD EFG community, is instructive. So that would be the Society of Biblical Literature, Greek New Testament. Westcott and Hort was the base text, and Holmes sided with Westcott and Hort against Tregelles, Robinson, Pierpont, and the Greek text behind the NIV in 98 places, more than such agreement against 3. Holmes was closest to the NIV and agreed with Robinson, Pierpont, 66 places against the others, second only to 98 agreements with Westcott and Hort. I'm excited about the rest of the session. Whoop, whoop. You're a legend. Da, da, da. I'm interested in da-da-da. And we're back 3 years ago. If someone said we would be watching this, they would have said I was insane. I've been waiting all my life for this, Mark. I'm glad you're back. Dwayne Green says, great discussion. I do need to say that Stephen Hackett and Jeffrey Dodson has played a much greater role in getting everything together for the Byzantine printing coming up. We're getting close, but we have a few more exciting things that are happening with it. On another note, it will be interesting to hear the panel discuss the idea of the papyrus manuscripts representing a localized Egyptian text. So Mark Ward says, he does comment, but other people say, would love to hear an update on the project. I may need to have Stephen and Jeffrey on to chat. I know Stephen, super nice guy. Dwayne says, do it. Very informative. Waiting my whole life for this. Great discussion. Love to be a fly on the wall. Love the first series. I don't know. These are just bots from India. I love it. I love it. You might need to explain ad hominem. I had to look it up back when I first started listening to you and talking about other debates. Okay. I would love to hear more about the differences between the TR and the majority text. Thanks so much for this forum. Excited for this. This series is a great follow-up to your comments on Burgon. I always thought that the criticism of Westcott and Hort needed to be studied by people who were not KJV only. Anxious for the following 3 episodes. James Snap says, Suter's material on Greek New Testament represents the base text of the English Revised Version. Suter's. So I think we were looking at, there was Peretz or something. Greek New Testament was the base for the ERV. Very, very close to the Westcott and Hort text. Great video. Can't get enough. Love you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. I'm about a third through the video, but as a Byzantine priority proponent, I couldn't help but smile during the following exchange. Peter Gurry, when talking about the CBGM paraphrasing, the computer helps the editors to keep track of all variant decisions and what manuscripts they favored, and I believe they had over 3,000 decisions to make. I don't believe Maurice Robinson had that many decisions. Maurice Robinson, no, I didn't have to make that many decisions. Yes, Mark says, yes, those two are great. And one of the messages we're trying to send here is the Byzantine prioritists and critical text proponents can have some good humor in their united opposition to textual absolutism. How's that for a comment? It's like, yes, they can actually get along and share a joke. And, you know, but we're all against the TR King James people because they're, you know, Ruckmanites. James Snap, the only 64 times is a meaningless statistic. So this is when Timothy Berg said that there are only 64 places where it was only Westcott and Hort readings were chosen in the translation of the English. It says, considering that Ellicott was every inch as pro-Alexandrian as Westcott and Hort were, and also considering that the Unitarian on the revision committee favored the Alexandrian text as well. So this is where I love James Snap's material, because sometimes he's invited into their circles, but he is on par with someone, you know, probably even better than the Shah guy who was there. And he will just say things that right off their position. And so he is probably considered more like a Pierpont guy. And it's quite funny. It's like, oh, the Byzantine guys and, you know, and us, we can get along. But then James Snap, who would be considered like a Byzantine sort of guy, he just comes along and just writes it off. It's quite funny. Okay, so most people don't really understand what they've watched. It says that I appreciate the work of David W. Daniels, his books and vlogs, and on Westcott and Hort and all things related to Bible translations. And then Mark Ward says, then you'll need to listen to the other side. Stay tuned. Is it true Westcott and Hort slept on a cot facing west? 2, Hort introduced his fiancée as the future cohort. Yes, all is true. I don't understand that. Future cohort, the more I think about it, the more I agree with what was said of Scrivener. I'm between the Byzantine and Nestle line, but I'm closer to the Byzantine. Mark says, the key line for the TCC is textual absolutism versus textual confidence. We stand with Byzantine prioritists and Scrivener against those who believe we have achieved the final form of the text. So if we believe we've got a Bible, we're heretics, we're wrong, we should be shunned. We're off the wall, we're Ruckmanites, we're weird, we're strange, avoid us. Just looking for some more here. So Helg says, I think Floyd Jones mentions Ruckman because he is right on the LXX, not necessarily because he defends Ruckman in other areas. Okay, great point. Thanks for that, Helg. Matt Singleton says, hi, Nick. How you doing, Matt? Good to see you. Helg says, Westcott and Hort were very close to textual absolutists regarding codices Aleph and B. Yeah, that's the thing. If they say, well, it's definitely 100%, you shouldn't have the comma Johannium in there. It should read as we say it. Isn't that absolutism, but just the other side of the coin? Matt Singleton says David W. Daniels is not brought up enough because he is the more even killed of the KJV only camp. And if you actually deal with his material, it'll be harder to strawman him. Yeah, and so I guess we all understand that Jack Chick, he used a lot of Ruckman material, the old IFB sort of stuff, and we would disagree with some of that stuff that was said, but some of it was actually really good as well. But David Daniels has come along, and he understands a lot of the argumentation, and when he's doing material, when he's doing a study, oftentimes I'll even converse with him and say, well, what have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Like when he was doing his series on Sinaiticus, I was talking about archaic Mark and doing some study into that and sending it to him. So that was back in 2016, I think, or 2015, I think it was. And so he's very open to chat and to talk about all these things. Hannah says, the TCC really do not understand what a horrible path they are blazing into. Nothing is the real word of God. Yeah. It's like, where are they going with this? You can have Byzantine priority. It's a smorgasbord, but it's like, is that the word of God? No. Is that the word of God? No. Is that the word of God? No. And you sort of like, which one is it? All of them are the word of God. There are many truths. They're all good readings. It's like, where do you go with that? Helg says David Daniels' material on the Apocrypha is very good. And so I've often thought of going through some of David Daniels' videos and just sort of having a bit of a comment on them. And that would be a good way of studying those type of things. I guess the Apocrypha has come up there's a debate on it. And also there is Bryan Ross is doing some videos on SoCal Preston's critique of his article, which I've been listening to every day except for today. And so very interesting, very good stuff. And so that's on his YouTube channel, on Chick YouTube channel. Here it says, it seemed a very drawn out explanation. I think that though you proved your points, but a much more concise video needs to be produced. As someone that is concerned about friends who are KJV only, I don't think they would sit through a long explanation. Thanks for the vid. It reaffirms my view that the King James Bible is the only Holy Bible for English-speaking people. I was particularly struck at how the panel tried to distance the modern fake English Bibles from Westcott and Hort. None of the panel entered a defense against some serious accusations against Westcott and Hort. So let's see if future videos do so. I was also surprised that the Westcott and Hort fanboy on the panel did not bring up the accusations against his heroes. And so Mark Ward replies, have patience, we will explain thee all. It says here, accusations against Westcott and Hort are irrelevant anyway. They weren't the only text critics of the 19th century who realized the Textus Receptus was flawed. Even if Westcott and Hort had not been on the committee, the revisers would still have plenty of other scholars to consult. That's the point the video makes. It has really, God allowed Bibles from the flawed line of text from the New Testament era all the way through to the present and needed to be corrected by another line of text over just the past 100 years, which the experts are still correcting. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Matthew 24:35. The words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. Thou shalt keep them, O Lord, thou shalt preserve them from this generation forever. Psalm 12:6-7. Then it says, there's no such thing as a flawed line of text. In opposition to an unflawed line of text, God chose to leave preservation largely to the hands of flawed human scribes, and the resulting lines of text, whether they be lines in the Hebrew manuscripts, lines in the Greek manuscripts, lines in the Latin manuscripts, lines in the Aramaic manuscripts, or any of the others, are all flawed and contradictory. That's the reality of the situation there, and taking issue with that is no different than taking issue with the existence of hurricanes or mosquitoes or anything else we don't like that God has elected to do. And making up lies about the textual tradition might be comforting, but it doesn't make it true. And then someone says, which Bible was the Holy Bible for all English-speaking people in 1610? And so you start to get this type of argumentation. And so interesting to read through. As a side note, I do not like the name of the group. Textual Confidence Collective. Collective has a communist overtone. I think that's just a joke. No, that's not the issue. Codex Sinaiticus changes were based on the lie that Sinaiticus was a 4th century. It was created in the 1800s. Mark says, how do you know that? Then someone says, there's no single real issue. The common issue raised by TR folks is that the supposed dependence on Westcott and Hort by all textual critics. This video addresses that issue. The distinct issue is the supposed forgery of Sinaiticus. There are both issues raised by, these are both issues raised by TR only believers and both false, but they are not the same issue. Don't blame Columbus for not discovering Australia. Mark said, Joshua, this is a conspiracy that even FHA Scrivener did not believe. It's weird that he has this whole thing of FHA Scrivener being like a, TR bulwark defender. He talks about Constantine Simonides, the progenitor of this conspiracy, as a con man. So that's the comments on the previous video. I'll just see what we've got on this one. Hopefully not too many, because I do want to
go. Spiritualism, like this was a decades-long or lifelong.
Just 94. Okay, yes. So Bible version conspiracy. This misrepresentation of Westcott and Hort has been on my radar for some time now. So this is Joseph Armstrong. But I haven't looked into it deeply. I'm looking forward to sharing this. Thanks both for bringing it to the forefront. And so Mark Ward says, hope you enjoy it. Absolutely. Fanboy stuff. Against Ripplinger. D.A. Waite saying that Jesus is in absolute union with God is heresy against the doctrine of the Trinity. The Athanasian Creed is one of the most succinct. Actually, I'm actually in the wrong video. That was really embarrassing. Which one were we just watching? This one. Sorry.
Welcome to another episode of the.
I'm hoping this one doesn't have that many comments. 64. Okay. It says, this series will be a very important resource. I find it surprising that when I've looked online, I find so little material about Westcott and Hort that doesn't come from a KJV only perspective. Westcott and Hort were important to the history of the Bible translation and also so widely maligned. It's puzzling that defenders of newer translations and post-1611 scholarship have done so little to offer a more balanced perspective on these two men. I appreciate these studies. Personally, I came from a background that is decidedly not KJV and was blissfully unaware of the issue until seminary. These studies helped me to understand where the Textus Receptus crowd are getting their talking points, and I can address those in my congregation background. He's going to parrot this stuff in his church. Yes, that's the goal. Joseph Armstrong says, I'm sad you guys really only got to the subject toward the end. Looking forward to the next one. Thank you for getting together again. Just a question. Earlier in the conversation, it was said that Gail Ripley publicly said she doesn't care if her statements are true. I would be very interested to see that. God bless. Good question. I'll see if I can get Peter to respond. That'll be interesting. Mark Ward, thank you. If she did, wow. If Peter can show where she stated her disinterest in truthfulness, that would be explosive. If she didn't, the irony of Peter's statement goes without being said. I appreciate you looking into this. Bobby Michael says she didn't say that. If she did, it was taken out of context. Mark Ward says the TCC is working on gathering info on this. We recognize that we have to retract that statement. It would be indeed ironic. See, this is what I love about just other people watching things and going, hang on, you said this. And see, I missed that one. But because Joseph Armstrong, he runs the Facebook group called Friends of Gail Ripley. He's very careful to watch and see what people are saying. And so I've got to be careful about what I say, because sometimes I'm trying to distance myself from her. But at the same time, she does say a lot of true things, as Ruckman does, as Gip does. But I disagree with the kooky things that they say. Hey Mark, I watched a video with you on Remnant Radio. Liked your position on KJV onlyism and subscribed to your channel. Great stuff. I'm new to Text Crit and saw on Rem Radio again an interview with S. Douglas Woodward about the Messiah being taken out of the Masoretic text by, I think, 1st or 2nd century rabbinical scribes. Does this mean the KJV Old Testament text is corrupted? Mark Ward says, I'm skeptical of this viewpoint, but I point you to John Mead at the Text and Canon Institute and their work more generally for answers on this specific topic. Thank you, sir, etc. Okay. Thank you for the reminder to be careful with accusations. I was KJV only for a long time. Toward the end of my being KJV only, someone I was listening to was asked to demonstrate an error in the KJV. They did, but it wasn't one I would consider major. it was a pretty small as far as errors go, and I had never heard of this particular place being an error. The bottom line is that as I pulled up my Greek New Testament and looked at what it said, I realized that even though it was a tiny error, I had to admit that if I were reading a Greek New Testament, I would never have read that verse the way the KJV has it. The thing is, I didn't admit it was an error for a while. I got really angry. I hated the man who pointed this out and wondered why God had even let people say the things this man said. I thought I was a zealous and defending God the whole time. It was only later I realized it was fleshly anger and was completely evil and wrong. Later, I asked God to forgive my anger and foolish thoughts regarding this situation. It took acknowledging that I was wrong before I realized the extent to which my fleshly anger, hate, and pride was controlling aspects of my faith. So I had to accept the zeal without knowledge is a bad thing. Having some time to really think through, and after removing myself from King James onlyism, I realized that the very strong emotions that would pour out of me over this issue were because of two things. First, I learned to have outbursts over this is from others who would have strong emotional reactions. I grew up seeing a lot of emotion over this issue. The part it is what learned behavior. So part it was a learned behavior, but secondly, I was taught that if the Bible had an error, yes, that is singular, then I could not trust what the Bible had said. And if we could not trust the Bible, how do we trust God? And so he continues to go on. You can read it all there for yourself. So basically it's sort of just going through saying there was an error. See, it's quite amazing when you go, okay, where was that error? And they show you, you're like, oh, actually it's answered here. And that was one of the things with Stephen Boyce. He said that he read through the book of Acts, and he was comparing the Greek where it has Moses was beautiful to God or something like that. And I can't remember exactly what the King James has, but it's an idiom. It's a Greek idiom. Or it's actually a Hebrew idiom that makes its way into the Greek. And when you read through that and you understand the Greek, the Hebrew language, and how it's brought into English, you can see that someone just reading an interlinear would go, oh, that reads something different. But he said that was one of the main verses that moved him away from the King James only position, which it was so, all I did was a quick Google search. Will Kinnear had a whole article on it. I think KJV even today had an article on it. And I might just quickly go to it, KJV today, .net. I offered the .com guys the other day. I said, how much to buy your website? The KJV.com, which has taken over from the author of the website, because they're starting to say the NIV is a good text and all that on there. And they said $10,000. I said, well, how about 500? And they came back with, no, 10,000 is our price. So they're obviously not interested in selling, because if I think they're in Slovakia, $500 is quite a lot of money over there. So I don't think they really want to sell it. So Acts chapter, here we are. Exceedingly fair or beautiful in God's sight. So this is one of the things. The King James does not say God in Acts 7:20, because Theo is in context. Sorry, Theo in the context is to be understood as a Hebraism. Strong's Hebrew and Greek dictionary says concerning Theos, of uncertain affinity, a deity, especially the supreme deity, figuratively a magistrate, by Hebraism, very, exceeding, God. So it does have this here. If you've got a Hebraism, it can mean exceeding, like exceeding fair. So, for example, the Hebrew word for God, Elohim, is translated exceedingly in Jonah 3:3. In many of the translations, all of those, the context in Jonah 3:3 is clear. So when you go through this article, it's basically saying this is a Hebraism. So this is the one thing that tipped Stephen Boyce over to, be sort of worried about the TR, because he was a TR guy and all the rest of it, and he's left the TR position because of this. So this is what I find with these long-winded, I was just in emotionalism. I wouldn't accept the fact that, there were errors and I was lying to myself and all this sort of stuff. And a lot of people do that with Revelation 16:5 until they read my book and find the truth. But it's like they jump over and say, oh, there's just mistakes. Oh, there's mistakes in all the Bible. And then they're sort of, it's like a crack in the door, and the door swings right open and they just jump out. And so it's quite interesting when you read through these. The vast majority of the time, they're dealing with an emotional plea and how they were all angry and they were upset and all this other stuff. And it's like, well, show us the text. Oh, no, you were wrong here. And every single time, it's just easily answered. It's hardly in anything. So 2 replies there. Yeah. And so this guy says, now my faith is in Jesus. So if you're reading the King James, your faith isn't in Jesus. It's in a translation, all this other rubbish. It says here, well, finally, how big is this? You start reading it and it's like, well, finally, someone in the textual criticism only field is seeking or has now tried to prove that these 2 men were not believers in the Bible that forms the baseline of all Christian beliefs since 1611 and its final edition in 1769. And even since Erasmus did the world see the New Testament was based on the best and majority of text. It's quite confusing, actually, so I won't read that one. Anyway, so I think that's about it for the comments. So let's go through some of these. Chick Track's YouTube channel, yes. Matt Singleton said Scripture should judge the creeds, not vice versa. Textual criticism leads people to Catholic memetics and away from exposition. Matt Singleton says if Waite has the false statement about the deity of Christ, you should use Scripture to correct and not the Athanasian Creed, which teaches legalism. Yeah. A. Hannah says Mark is only an expert in his narcissism. All other questions get referred elsewhere to other experts. Yeah, it's quite amazing. Like Mark he's not really an expert in any of this. Like, and then he is just sort of making comments like, we're just sort of brainwashed. We're, absolutists, we're Ruckmanites and all the rest. So he's just basically offering just an opinion, but he's not really. That's why he invites all these other guys on to talk about this technical stuff. But I think most of it goes over Mark Wart's head. Mark does not make a lot of anecdotes which are really unverified. Mark does make a lot of anecdotes which are really unverified. Yeah, I think so. Helg says, thank you very much, Nick, for many really good points in this stream. It has been a treat, but that's an understatement. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. We've gone for 3.5 hours. Hopefully we can do this second video. We'll go through that. We'll go through all the comments, and I might, in the meanwhile, look at some of the Facebook comments too, because it has been posted around everywhere on Facebook, and a lot of really good points where people are pointing out the racism of Westcott and Hort and a whole bunch of other stuff that it's like, are you going to bring this up? Are you going to bring that up? And people are sort of backpedaling, because the thing is, it's pretty hard to defend these guys. It's a hard task. So anyway, guys, God bless you, and we'll see you next time.